Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. My hand trembles as I pour my tea. The ceramic cup rattles against the saucer, and a few drops spill over the edge. I'm not as steady as I used to be. That's what happens when you reach 75. But today, the shaking has nothing to do with age. Jerry from the local historical society sits across from me, his tape recorder running on my kitchen table. He wants stories of old Saskatchewan, tales of pioneer life before everything got paved and connected. Little does he know what he's about to hear. "Isabel," he prompts gently, "you mentioned something about why your family left the north." I set the teacup down and stare through my window at the neat suburban street outside. 68 years have passed since that night, but the memory remains as sharp as broken glass. "We lived farther north than folks do nowadays," I begin, my voice steadier than my hands. "Just a few miles from the Northwest Territory border. No roads reached us. The closest neighbor was 17 miles away, just us. Ma, Pa, my 4 brothers, 3 sisters, and me. I was 7 years old. The tape recorder hums. Jerry waits. Our cabin was small, just one room, maybe 20 by 15 feet. Pa built it himself, logs chinked with moss and mud, one window with oiled paper instead of glass. We were poor, but we managed. Pa trapped and hunted. Ma preserved everything she could. We survived." I paused to sip my tea. It happened in October 1955. The first snow had just fallen, about 3 inches on the ground. Pa had shot a moose 2 days before, and we were eating well. That night, Ma made moose steaks with dried berries we'd gathered in summer. We had a feast. My throat tightens as the memories flood back. The taste of that meal, the warmth of the wood stove, the sound of my siblings laughing, the last normal moments. It was past dark, maybe 8 o'clock. Pa had just stoked the fire for the night. The younger kids were already asleep in the big bed. We all shared for warmth. Me, Pa, Ma, and my oldest brother Thomas were still at the table. That's when it happened. I close my eyes. The sounds come back first. There was a snuffling noise outside the door. Pa thought it was a bear. He reached for his rifle, but before he could grab it, the door burst open. The wooden latch just snapped clean off. My breathing quickens as I tell it. My palms grow damp. It wasn't a bear. It filled the doorway, taller than Pa, who was 6'2", wide shoulders and hair covered in dark hair. Not fur like an animal, more like hair, but all over. Jerry's eyes widen, but he doesn't interrupt. It stood on 2 legs, like a man, but not a man. Its arms hung down to its knees, and the smell, like wet wool and something rotten underneath. I remember Pa's face, the color draining away, his hand frozen halfway to his gun. Pa yelled, "Get back!" He pushed Ma behind him. Thomas grabbed me, and we scrambled to the corner where the little ones were sleeping. Ma pulled the blankets over all of us. I could still see through a gap, though. My hand goes to my chest, feeling my heart pound, just as it did that night. It came in, ducked its head under the door frame. Its breath made clouds in the cold air coming in. Pa backed up, moving toward us, never taking his eyes off it. The thing, it ignored us. It went straight to the table. I remember the silence. No one breathed. No one moved. Our dinner was still there. The rest of the moose meat was hanging from the rafters, curing. The creature reached up. It didn't even need to stretch, and pulled down a whole haunch of moose. Must have weighed 30 pounds. Then it sat at our table. Jerry's pen hovers over his notepad, forgotten. That's when the sounds started. The sounds I still hear when I wake up at night. I swallow hard. It ate. Not like a person, not even like a wild animal. It tore chunks off with its hands and shoved them into its mouth. The crunching, the gnashing of teeth on bone, the wet smacking of its lips, the growling from deep in its throat when it swallowed. My fingers clutched the teacup as if it could anchor me to the present. We sat there for nearly an hour, frozen under those blankets, watching it eat, every scrap of meat in our cabin. When it was done, it stood up. It turned and looked directly at us. I feel a cold prickle up my spine, just as I did back then. Its eyes were aware, not animal eyes. It knew we were there, hiding. It knew we were afraid. It watched us for maybe 10 seconds, then it turned and walked out. Didn't close the door, just left. The kitchen feels too warm now, but I don't move to open a window. None of us moved for the longest time. The kids were crying silently. Ma was praying. Pa finally got up and shut the door, putting a chair against it since the latch was broken. We all huddled together in one bed that night. Nobody slept. Jerry clears his throat. "What happened then?" he asks. "First light. Pa hitched up our only horse to the wagon. He told us to stay inside, doors barred. He rode to the Mountie post at Fort Clearwater, 18 miles each way. Came back after dark with 2 officers. Red coats, we called them then. I remember their red serge jackets, bright as blood against the snow. They looked around outside with lanterns. Found the tracks. One officer, Sergeant Mills was his name. His face went white when he saw them. 18 inches. He said, measuring with his hands. Nobody makes tracks this big. The memory is crystal clear. The Mountie's face illuminated from below by the lantern, his breath making clouds as he spoke to Pa just outside our window. The sergeant came inside. He was direct with Pa. "Pack what you can carry," he said. "Leave today. This thing will come back. Next time it might not just want your food." I set my empty teacup down with a click. We left everything that wouldn't fit in the wagon. Pa's tools, Ma's big loom, most of our winter stores. We took clothes, blankets, Pa's rifle, and what food we could carry. By noon we were gone. The loss of that home, the only one I'd known, still aches faintly after all these years. We went to my uncle's place near Prince Albert. 9 of us crammed into his small house. Pa found work at a lumber mill. We never went back to the cabin, never lived in the deep bush again. Jerry fiddles with his tape recorder. "Did you ever tell anyone else about this?" I shake my head. "Who would believe us? Pa told us not to speak of it." "People will think we're crazy," he said. "The Mounties filed some report, but I doubt anything came of it." "And you never heard of other similar incidents? Never read about Bigfoot or Sasquatch?" Jerry asks. "Oh, I've seen those stories in papers over the years. Blurry photos. Hoaxes, most likely. What came to our cabin that night wasn't some man in a costume. It was real. Its breath fogged the cold air. Its weight made our floor creak, the sounds it made when it ate." I trail off. The kitchen is silent except for the ticking clock. The day after we left, a storm came through. 2 feet of snow. Whatever tracks were left would have been covered. Our cabin probably rotted away years ago. No evidence remains, just my memories. Jerry turns off his tape recorder. His face has a strange expression. Not quite disbelief, but uncertainty. "Thank you for sharing this, Isabel," he says carefully. I nod. I'm used to that tone, the polite skepticism. After Jerry leaves, I sit alone in my kitchen. The house feels too quiet. I turn on the radio for company, but it doesn't help. My mind keeps going back to that night. We never discussed it, even among ourselves. Ma would change the subject if anyone brought it up. Pa grew angry if questioned. My siblings and I learned to keep silent. But we all remembered Thomas died in 1978, a logging accident. Before he passed, delirious with pain, he spoke of it. "It's coming back," he said to me. "Can you hear it chewing?" A car door slams outside, startling me back to the present. My daughter Carol pulls into the driveway, returning from grocery shopping. She'll stay for dinner, then drive home to her family. She worries about me living alone. I stand and smooth my apron. I won't tell Carol about the interview today. She grew up hearing her grandfather change the subject whenever the old cabin was mentioned. She knows something happened up north, but not what. I've kept it from her, just as Pa insisted we keep it from everyone. But as I move to greet her, I catch sight of the evening news on my small kitchen TV. The volume is low, but the headline crawl catches my eye. Hunters missing in northern Saskatchewan. The reporter stands in front of dense forest. Behind him, red-jacketed Mounties search the underbrush. Some things never change. 3 hunters from Saskatoon failed to return from their annual moose hunting trip, the reporter says. Their camp was found abandoned yesterday with signs of a disturbance. Most unusual was the discovery that all their harvested game and food supplies were missing. My hand goes to my throat. Authorities are continuing the search, but note that with temperatures dropping below freezing, time is running short. I turn off the television as Carol enters with grocery bags. "Hi, Mom," she says, kissing my cheek. "Anything interesting happened today?" I force a smile. "Nothing worth mentioning," I say. Later, after Carol leaves, I sit in the dark living room. The temperature has dropped outside and a light snow begins to fall. Just like that night so long ago. I think about those hunters, their camp empty, their food gone. I think about warning signs ignored, about hungry creatures in the deep woods. I think about the sounds, the terrible sounds of something not quite human devouring raw meat, sounds that have echoed in my nightmares for 68 years. I consider calling the RCMP station. What would I say? That my family was terrorized by a giant hairy creature in 1955, that I believe the same thing might have happened to those hunters. They'd think I was a confused old woman. Instead, I lock my doors, I check my windows, I leave the lights on, and I listen, always listen for the sound of teeth gnashing in the darkness. Story 2. October 27th, 1975. I tap my fingers against the steering wheel of my police cruiser, watching the fog roll across the empty road. My radio crackled to life, breaking the silence. "Dispatch to Sergeant Cooper." I grabbed the receiver. "Cooper here. Got another call from the Smith property. Same as before." My stomach tightened. 4 days since the first incident, and it wasn't letting up. I turned the key, and the engine roared to life. "On my way." The headlights cut through the mist as I drove toward the Lummi Nation Indian Reserve. My name is Ken Cooper, sergeant with the Lummi Tribal Police for 8 years now. Before that, I served in the county sheriff's department. I'd responded to everything from domestic disputes to drunk drivers, but nothing prepared me for what began on October 23rd. The road curved through dense forest before opening to scattered houses. I pulled into Emma Smith's gravel driveway, my tires crunching over the rocks. The porch light flickered yellow against the night. Emma stood waiting, her tiny frame wrapped in a thick sweater despite the mild temperature. "It came back, Ken," she said as I approached. Her voice quavered. "Tried the smokehouse again." I nodded, retrieving my flashlight from my belt. "Let me take a look." The beam swept across the yard toward the small wooden structure about 50 feet from the main house. As I approached, the damage became clear. 3 more boards had been ripped from the side, exposing the interior. The wood hadn't been cut or sawed. It was splintered and torn, as if pulled apart by something with tremendous strength. "Did you see it this time?" I asked, kneeling to examine the broken planks. "Just heard it. That same huffing sound, like something breathing heavy." Emma hugged herself tighter. "Then wood cracking." I yelled and it stopped. I ran my fingers along the jagged edge of a board. Fresh break happened within the hour. Nothing about this fit the pattern of vandalism or break-ins I'd seen before. The damage was too random, too forceful. "I'll check the perimeter," I said, standing. I circled the property slowly, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. No footprints. No tire tracks, No evidence of intruders, at least not human ones. The trees surrounding Emma's property swayed in the breeze, branches clacking together like bones. "I'll make another pass through the area tonight," I told Emma after completing my search. "Maybe set up near the smokehouse for a few hours. You believe me, don't you?" Her eyes sought mine. "It's not kids or drunks. It's something else." I chose my words carefully. "I believe something's been damaging your property. We'll figure out what it is." The radio squawked from my belt. Another call, this one from the Miller farm 3 miles east. Similar complaint. Property damage, something large moving around their barn. "I have to go," I told Emma. "Lock your doors. Call immediately if it returns." Her face fell. "It will. It always comes back." By midnight, I'd responded to 3 more calls, all with the same pattern. Property damage, strange sounds, no witnesses seeing the actual culprit. I stopped at the station to refill my thermos with coffee. The night dispatcher, Tom Wells, looked up from his crossword puzzle. "Busy night, Sarge?" I poured the steaming liquid into my cup. "Same as the last 4. Something's got everyone spooked." "You think there's anything to these stories?" Tom leaned back in his chair. "People saying it's a Sasquatch and all." I shrugged. "People see what they want to see." But I couldn't dismiss what I'd observed. The damage patterns didn't match any animal I knew. Bears don't tear buildings apart board by board. Mountain lions don't rip doors from hinges, and neither animal would repeatedly target human structures while avoiding livestock or garbage. "Call me if anything else comes in," I said, heading for the door. "I'm heading back to check on Emma Smith." The drive back to Emma's took 15 minutes. When I arrived, her house was dark except for a single light in the kitchen. No sign of disturbance. I parked my cruiser 100 yards down the road, killed the engine and settled in for surveillance. The night grew quiet. An hour passed, then another. My eyelids grew heavy. I pinched my arm, took another sip of coffee. A twig snapped in the forest to my right. I sat up straight, suddenly alert. My hand instinctively moved to my holster. Another crack, this one louder. Something large was moving through the underbrush. I reached for my spotlight, but hesitated. If I illuminated whatever was out there, I might scare it off before identifying it. Better to wait, let it emerge. The rustling grew closer. I could hear branches being pushed aside, heavy footfalls on the forest floor. Then came a smell, rank and musky, like wet fur mixed with something rotten. My heart hammered against my ribs. A shadow separated from the tree line, tall, impossibly tall. My breath caught in my throat. It stood upright on 2 legs, silhouetted against the night sky. 7 feet at least, broad shoulders, arms hanging low. It paused at the edge of Emma's yard, head turning slowly, surveying. I reached for my radio, pressed the button. "Dispatch," I whispered. No response. Static filled the line. The figure moved again, lumbering toward Emma's smokehouse with surprising speed. I couldn't wait any longer. I threw open my door, drew my service revolver and shouted, "Police! Stop right there!" The creature froze. Then it turned toward me. I flipped on my spotlight, aiming the beam directly at it. The light revealed what my mind refused to accept. Not a man, not a bear, but something between. Covered in dark, matted fur, a broad, flat face with deep-set eyes that reflected the light like a deer's. Massive shoulders hunched forward. It stood fully upright, staring at me without fear. "Jesus Christ," I whispered. The creature let out a low, rumbling sound, somewhere between a growl and a groan. Then it turned and ran, not back into the forest, but toward Emma's house. I sprinted after it, yelling, "Stop! Police!" My service revolver felt inadequate in my hand. The creature moved with surprising speed, covering ground in long strides. It reached Emma's porch before I could close half the distance. With one powerful motion, it ripped at the storm door, plastic tearing like paper. Then it grabbed the wooden doorframe, pulling with such force that the wood splintered. Emma's screams pierced the night. "Get away from there!" I shouted, firing a warning shot into the air. The gunshot echoed across the property. The creature hesitated, then turned toward me. For one terrible moment, our eyes met. There was intelligence there, and something else. Rage, maybe, or hunger. Then it bolted, not toward me or the forest, but around the side of the house. I pursued, but by the time I rounded the corner, it had vanished into the tree line. Emma stood in her doorway, clutching a shotgun. "Did you see it?" she demanded. "Did you see the creature?" I nodded, unable to speak for a moment. My training hadn't prepared me for this. Nothing had. "I'm calling for backup," I finally managed. "We need to get you somewhere safe." By 2:30 a.m., word had spread. When I returned to Emma's property, after taking her to stay with her daughter in town, I was shocked to find 7 vehicles parked haphazardly in her yard. Local men with rifles and shotguns milled about, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. "What the hell is going on here?" I demanded, approaching the group. Bill Jenkins, a local fisherman I knew from town, stepped forward. "Heard you had some trouble, Sergeant. Thought you could use some help." "This is a police matter," I said firmly. "You all need to go home." "With all due respect," another man interjected, "we've got families to protect. If there's a Sasquatch out here attacking homes—" "I never said anything about a Sasquatch," I cut him off. "Then what was it?" Bill challenged. "Emma's been telling everyone it's a Bigfoot. Now you've seen it too." Before I could respond, one of the men shouted, "There, at the tree line!" All heads turned. Spotlights swept across the property, converging on a point where the yard met the forest. And there it stood, the same creature, or one like it. In the combined beams of our lights, I could see it clearly now. It stood at least 7.5 feet tall, its body covered in dark brown fur that hung in matted clumps. Its face was flattened, with a pronounced brow ridge and a wide mouth. The eyes reflected yellow in our lights. It stood with its shoulders hunched forward, arms hanging almost to its knees. "Jesus," someone whispered. One of the men raised his shotgun, a 12-gauge, and aimed it directly at the creature's chest. "No!" I shouted, moving between him and his target. "Lower your weapon! We don't know what that is! It could be a person in a costume!" "That ain't no costume," the man growled, trying to step around me. I placed my hand on his barrel, pushing it down. I said lower it. Now. Reluctantly, he complied. I turned back toward the creature, which had crouched lower, as if preparing to flee or attack. "Nobody moves," I ordered. "Nobody shoots." For the next 20 minutes we stood in a tense standoff. The creature gradually lowered itself until only its head remained visible above the brush. I kept my hand on my holster, watching, waiting. The men behind me fidgeted nervously, whispering among themselves. Then came the sounds, rustling from multiple directions in the surrounding forest. Branches snapping, heavy footfalls, soft, guttural vocalizations. "There's more of them," Bill whispered. "They've got us surrounded." The creature we could see continued to watch us, unblinking. The noises grew closer, more insistent. "Everyone back to your vehicles," I ordered, my voice steady despite the fear gripping my chest. "Now. Move slowly. We're leaving." "We can't just let them," one of the men started. "I said we're leaving," I repeated firmly. "That's an order." We backed toward our vehicles, spotlights still trained on the visible creature. It made no move to follow, but the sounds from the forest intensified. As we reached our cars, I heard a sound I'll never forget. A high, undulating scream that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was something else entirely. "Go!" I shouted. "Everyone out now!" The men scrambled into their trucks and peeled away, gravel flying. I was the last to leave, backing my cruiser down the driveway, keeping my spotlight trained on the tree line until the last possible moment. Dawn broke cold and clear. I returned to Emma's property with 2 other officers. The night's events seemed almost dreamlike in the morning light, but the evidence was undeniable. Across the frost-covered ground, a trail of massive barefoot prints led from the forest edge to Emma's house and back again. I knelt beside one, placing my hand next to it for scale. The print measured at least 18 inches long and 7 inches wide, with 5 distinct toes. The depth of the impression suggested whatever made it weighed hundreds of pounds. "What do you make of this, Sarge?" Officer Daniels asked, crouching beside me. I shook my head. "I don't know, but it's not a bear, and it's not a hoax. Not unless someone's running around with fake feet in the middle of the night just to tear apart buildings." We followed the tracks to where they disappeared back into the forest. None of us suggested pursuing them further. Some boundaries weren't meant to be crossed. Over the next 2 weeks, the reports flooded in. The Lummi Tribal Police received over 100 Sasquatch sighting reports. 3 dogs were found dead, their necks broken. A horse on the Peterson farm suffered a severe neck wound that required 16 stitches, and I saw them twice more. Once from a distance, a shadowy figure crossing the road ahead of my cruiser around midnight. The second time up close, too close, when I responded to a call at the tribal fishing docks and found one of the creatures tearing apart a storage shed. It fled when I approached, but not before turning to face me with what I can only describe as a threatening display, beating its chest and emitting that same terrible scream. The situation grew increasingly tense. Armed citizens began patrolling at night, looking for the creatures. The Lummi Tribal Council called an emergency meeting, which I attended alongside other tribal officials. "These people are going to get themselves killed," I told the council, "either by shooting each other in the dark or by provoking these creatures into attacking." After heated debate, the council made an unprecedented decision. They officially outlawed shooting the Sasquatch, not to protect the creatures, but to protect the people hunting them. "There are no people on the road at night now," I reported at a follow-up meeting. "Everyone's scared, even the folks who called us crazy a few weeks ago. They've either seen the footprints themselves or heard the screams." Chief William Blackfeet, head of the tribal council, nodded gravely. "Our ancestors spoke of the forest people, said they were to be respected, left alone. We didn't listen. Now they're angry." I didn't know about ancient legends or forest people. I only knew what I'd seen with my own eyes. Something powerful, intelligent, and dangerous had claimed the forests around our reservation. Something that wasn't afraid of humans or our weapons. Something that could tear apart buildings with its bare hands. The reports continued through November, then gradually tapered off as winter deepened. By December, the sightings had stopped entirely. Some speculated the creatures had migrated south for the winter. Others believed they'd moved deeper into the mountains to hibernate. I kept my opinion to myself, but I checked my sidearm more frequently on night patrols. I paid more attention to shadows moving between trees. I rolled up my windows when driving through remote areas, even on warm nights. Because I knew what the others only suspected, the creatures hadn't left. They were watching, waiting, and sooner or later they would return. When they did, I hoped we'd be ready. But deep down, I knew the truth. Nothing could prepare us for what lurked in the forests of the Lummi Nation. Nothing at all. Story 3. The night air felt different. I noticed it right away as I parked my old Ford pickup near the bridge at Loyal Hannah Creek. Been coming to this spot since I was a boy, and at 67 years old, I'd seen just about everything these Pennsylvania woods had to offer. Or so I thought. May 18th, 1988. That date's burned into my memory now. Started like any other fishing trip. I arrived at Sleepy Hollow around 10:30 p.m., planning to do some night fishing with my lantern. The creek water ran clear and cool beneath the bridge, and a half moon hung overhead, casting just enough light to navigate by. I unloaded my gear methodically, tackle box, rod, bait bucket, and my Coleman lantern. Habit made me grab my 3-cell spotlight too. 50 years in these woods taught me to always have a good light. Never knew when you'd need to spot something in the dark. The temperature dropped to about 45 degrees, and I pulled my flannel jacket tighter. The only sounds were the gentle gurgle of the creek and the occasional hoot of an owl. I set up my spot about 10 feet from the water's edge, placing my lantern on a flat rock and my gear within easy reach. At around 11 p.m., I was threading a night crawler onto my hook when I heard it. A scuffling noise from the wooded hillside, maybe 25 feet away. Not the normal sounds of woodland creatures. This was heavier, more deliberate. My first thought was bear. We got plenty of black bears in these parts. But something about the sound didn't match. Bears have a certain way of moving, a rhythm I'd recognize anywhere after tracking them for decades. The scuffling stopped, then started again, closer this way. My hand moved to the spotlight, fingers wrapping around the familiar handle. "Hello?" I called out, feeling foolish. No one answered, just more scuffling, now accompanied by the crack of branches. I switched on my spotlight and aimed it at the tree line. The beam caught it square in the face. My blood turned to ice. Two fiery orange eyes reflected back at me, glowing with an internal light that no natural animal possesses. They were set in a massive head covered with thick red-brown hair. The face, if you could call it that, wasn't quite animal, wasn't quite human. The jaw was heavy, with teeth partially visible even with its mouth closed. I've field-dressed 1,000 deer. I've tracked bears, coyotes, and wildcats. I've stood 10 feet from a bull moose in rut. But nothing prepared me for the sheer size of what stood at the edge of those trees. This thing made an extra-large gorilla look like a small chimpanzee by comparison. Its shoulders must have been 4 feet across, with arms hanging down past where knees would be on a human. The hands, paws, were massive, with curved claws visible even from where I stood. Then the smell hit me, like rotten meat, wet fur, and something else, something chemical and sharp that I couldn't identify. The stench was so powerful it made my eyes water and my stomach heave. For 3, maybe 4 seconds, we just stared at each other, me rooted to the spot, and this creature, half hidden in the tree line. Then it moved. It stepped fully into the open, rising to its full height, 8 feet tall, minimum, maybe 9. Its chest was barrel-shaped, covered in the same red-brown hair, but thicker there. The legs were thick as tree trunks, bent slightly like a bear's, but with a more human proportion. The creature tilted its head, those burning orange eyes never leaving mine. Then it made a sound, a deep, rumbling growl that started low and built until it seemed to vibrate the ground beneath my feet. That sound broke my paralysis. I dropped the spotlight, still lit, and it rolled on the ground, casting crazy, spinning shadows across the scene. My fishing rod clattered onto the rocks. I backed up, stumbling over my tackle box. The creature took another step forward, then another. Its movement had a purpose to it. This wasn't curiosity. This was predatory. It was coming for me. I turned and ran. 50 years of hunting and tracking, and I ran like a scared child. My boots slipped on the dewy grass as I scrambled toward my truck, parked about 30 yards away. Behind me I heard heavy footfalls, branches snapping, that growl growing louder. My hands shook so bad I dropped my keys, had to drop to my knees, feeling around in the dark while straining to hear how close it was getting. My fingers closed around the keyring, and I lunged for the driver's door. I yanked it open and threw myself inside, slamming the door shut. My trembling hands struggled with the key, missing the ignition twice before finally sliding it in. The whole time I kept my eyes on the side mirror, watching for movement. The engine caught with a roar, and I hit the headlight switch. The beams cut through the darkness toward my abandoned fishing spot. And there it stood, right where I'd been. My lantern illuminated it from below, while my headlights caught it from the front. For one clear, terrible moment I saw it fully. No bear, no gorilla, nothing I'd ever seen in 50 years of woodscraft. Its face had a flat nose, almost like a boxer dog's, but wider. The jaw jutted forward, with teeth too big for the mouth. Those eyes reflected my headlights now, burning orange circles in the night. It looked right at me. Then it did something that froze the blood in my veins. It stood straighter, almost human-like, and took a deliberate step toward my truck. I slammed the gear shift into reverse, spinning the tires on the dirt as I backed onto the access road. The creature broke into a loping run, covering ground faster than anything its size should be able to move. I cranked the wheel, shifted to drive, and floored it. As I sped away, I checked the rearview mirror. For a few seconds, the creature followed, easily keeping pace with my truck at 25 mph. Then it veered off into the woods and disappeared. I drove straight home, 10 miles over the speed limit the whole way. My hands didn't stop shaking until I was inside my house with the doors locked. I sat at my kitchen table until dawn, a loaded shotgun across my lap. The next morning, I questioned everything. Had I really seen what I thought I saw? At my age, was my mind playing tricks? But the memory was too vivid, too detailed. The smell still lingered in my nostrils. I called my buddy Frank Miller, who'd been my hunting partner for 30 years. "Need your help with something," I told him, trying to keep my voice steady. "What's up, Jim?" Frank asked. "Left some gear down at Sleepy Hollow last night, fishing stuff. Want to go retrieve it?" "Something wrong?" Frank knew me too well. Must have heard the strain in my voice. "Just come over. I'll explain when you get here." Frank arrived within the hour, his own shotgun in the rack of his truck. Smart man. I told him everything on the drive back to Sleepy Hollow. He didn't laugh or call me crazy, which is why Frank was my best friend. He just listened, nodding occasionally, his face growing more serious as I described the creature's size and behavior. "You really think it's still there?" he asked as we pulled up to the spot, parking a good 50 yards from where I'd fled the night before. "No," I said, checking that my revolver was loaded. "But I'm not taking chances." We approached cautiously, scanning the tree line. In daylight, the place looked ordinary enough. Birds sang. The creek burbled peacefully. Hard to believe what had happened just hours ago. My fishing gear lay scattered where I'd dropped it. The lantern had burned out. My spotlight was still there, its batteries dead. Frank kneeled down to examine something on the ground. "Jim," he said quietly, "take a look at this." I squatted beside him. There, pressed into the soft earth near the creek bank, was a footprint. Not human, not bare. The impression was huge, easily 16 inches long and 8 inches wide at the ball of the foot. 5 toe marks were clearly visible, with small circular depressions at the tips where claws would be. Frank placed his hand next to it for scale. His hand looked child-sized in comparison. "What do you make of this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head. "In 50 years in these woods, I've never seen a track like that." We found more prints leading from the tree line to where I'd been standing, then toward where I'd parked my truck. The stride length was enormous, over 4 feet between impressions. At the edge of the woods, Frank pointed to a broken branch, snapped clean off about 7 feet up. Fresh sap still oozed from the break. "Something big came through here," he said. We followed the tracks as far as we could, into the woods about 100 yards. Then they disappeared on the rocky ground of a dry creek bed. "I believe you," Frank said as we walked back to gather my fishing gear. "That's no bear. No known animal makes tracks like that." I nodded, relieved that I had corroboration but unsettled by the confirmation. This wasn't my imagination. Something had been here. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about the encounter. I went to the library in Johnson Creek, the nearest town, and researched local folklore. Found a few old stories about wild men in the Pennsylvania woods, dating back to settler days. Even a newspaper clipping from 1952 about strange tracks found near Loyalhanna Creek. I asked around discreetly. Old-timers at the bait shop had stories, second or third-hand accounts of hunters seeing something strange in the deep woods. Loggers who quit their jobs after being watched by something in the forest. A family that abandoned their isolated cabin in 1973 after repeated nighttime visits from an animal that tried to break in through their windows. None of these stories made the news. People don't talk about such things openly. They're afraid of ridicule, or worse, afraid of confirming what they've tried to convince themselves was just imagination. 1 month after my encounter, I returned to Sleepy Hollow. Daylight this time, with Frank and his cousin Earl, who worked as a game warden. We brought cameras and plaster casting materials, hoping to document any signs we might find. The area seemed undisturbed. Earl examined the bridge and the surrounding terrain with professional scrutiny. "There've been reports," he admitted finally. "Nothing official, mind you, but enough that some of us keep an ear open for certain kinds of sightings." "What kind of sightings?" Frank asked. Earl shrugged. "Big animal, wrong proportions for a bear, strong smell, usually active at night. Department writes it off as misidentified black bears or people's imaginations." "You don't believe that," I said. It wasn't a question. "Let's just say I've seen things that don't match any known species in these woods." Earl looked uncomfortable. "Tracks that don't match up. Deer carcasses handled in ways no predator around here would manage. We spent the afternoon searching but found nothing conclusive. As sunset approached, Earl suggested we leave. These things, whatever they are, they're more active at night, and they don't like being studied," he said, checking his watch nervously. As we packed up to leave, I felt it again, that sensation of being watched. I looked toward the hillside where I'd first seen the creature. Nothing visible, but the birds had gone quiet. "We should go," I said. Frank and Earl must have sensed it too. We didn't speak as we hurried back to our vehicles. As I started my truck, I caught movement from the corner of my eye, something large shifting position among the trees, just a flash of red-brown against the darkening woods. I didn't point it out, just put the truck in gear and led our small convoy away from Sleepy Hollow. I never went back to fish at Loyal Hannah Creek after that. Some places in this world belong to something else, something that was here long before us and will remain long after we're gone. Sleepy Hollow is one of those places. I still hunt and fish elsewhere, still spend time in the woods. But I'm more cautious now. I listen differently, watch the shadows with new awareness, and I never stay out after dark. What I saw that night in May 1988 wasn't a bear or any known animal. It wasn't a man in a suit or a case of mistaken identity. It was something primeval that emerged from the darkness to hunt me. Something that blended human and beast in ways that trigger the most primitive fear responses in even the most experienced outdoorsman. I don't know what to call it. Some might say Bigfoot or Sasquatch, but those names seem inadequate for what I encountered. This was no gentle forest giant from tabloid headlines. This was a predator, intelligent and purposeful. 50 years of experience in tracking and hunting animals taught me to read the woods, to understand the behaviors of wildlife. Nothing in those decades prepared me for what stalked me at Sleepy Hollow. I tell this story now not to convince anyone, but as a warning. There are things in the wild places that defy explanation, things that watch from the shadows, that know these forests in ways we never will, and sometimes they hunt us. Story 4. I still remember the heat. That's what sticks with you after fighting wildfires, the persistent, overwhelming heat that bakes into your bones and stays there. September 2003 was my 4th season on the crew. At 21, I'd already seen more burning forest than most people would in a lifetime. Growing up on the Apache reservation in northern New Mexico, I'd been raised with stories about respecting the land. Now I was paid to protect it. "Blackfeather, bus leaves in 20, shouted Captain Ramirez as I finished packing my gear. My name is Sandra Blackfeather. On that September morning, I was just one of 23 firefighters being dispatched to Trinity County, California. The Del Loma fire had been raging for days in the Shasta Trinity forest. Standard procedure, or so I thought. The ride was long and quiet. Most of us tried to sleep, knowing that once we arrived, rest would become precious. I sat near the window, watching the landscape change from desert to dense forest. Billy Hawkins, a veteran firefighter from Oklahoma, sat beside me, cleaning his fingernails with a pocket knife. "First time in Trinity?" he asked without looking up. "Yeah," I replied. "You been before?" Billy nodded. "3 times. Strange forest. Locals say things live in those woods." I laughed. "Things live in all woods, Billy." He didn't laugh back. "Not like these things." I dismissed his comment as the usual hazing of newer crew members. Every region had its legends. Back home, elders spoke of skinwalkers. Here I assumed it was probably tales of mountain lions or bears blown out of proportion. We arrived at the command post by nightfall. The fire was contained but still burning, covering the horizon with an orange glow that made the clouds look like they were bleeding. The air tasted of ash. To my surprise, we weren't immediately sent to the fire line. "You'll be on standby," explained the incident commander, a tall woman with a weathered face named Diane. "We've got crews on the main fire, but we need you ready in case it jumps containment." For nearly 2 weeks, that's what we did. We waited, we trained, we maintained equipment, we slept in shifts. The monotony was almost worse than fighting an active fire. On day 13, we were instructed to set up camp closer to the river, about 5 to 10 miles from the original fire site. The location was remote, surrounded by ancient trees that blocked most of the sunlight. The river provided a natural barrier against fire spread, and the sound of running water was a welcome change from the constant radio chatter. I pitched my tent near the edge of our camp, preferring some distance from the snorers. The forest around us felt old, in a way I couldn't explain. The trees were massive, their branches creating a canopy that made it feel like twilight even at noon. After setting up, I crawled into my sleeping bag early. The constant standby had been exhausting in its own way. I must have dozed off because I woke to sounds of commotion outside my tent. Voices were raised, not in panic but excitement. "Just let me sleep," I muttered, pulling my sleeping bag over my head. Whatever animal had wandered into camp, probably a deer or raccoon, wasn't worth losing precious rest over. The voices grew louder. I heard footsteps approaching my tent. "Sandra! Sandra, you gotta see this!" It was Mike Chen, one of the younger guys on the crew. "Go away, Mike," I called out. The zipper on my tent flew open. Mike's face appeared, his eyes wide. "Sandra, I'm serious. You need to come now." Something in his voice made me sit up. Mike wasn't the type to overreact. "What is it?" I asked, reaching for my boots. "Just come," he said, disappearing from view. I pulled on my boots and jacket and stepped outside. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees. Most of the crew had gathered at the riverbank, pointing across the water. I followed Mike as he pushed through the small crowd. "Look," he said, pointing. At first, I didn't see anything, just trees and underbrush on the opposite bank. Then something moved. It wasn't a deer, it wasn't a bear. It was walking upright. "What the hell is that?" I whispered. No one answered. We all just stood there watching as a massive figure emerged from the tree line across the river. It was huge, at least 7 feet tall and covered in dark, long hair. Not fur like a bear, but hair, maybe 5 or 6 inches long, covering its entire body. The hair was a deep brown, almost blackish in the fading light. But what struck me most was how it moved. It walked exactly like a human on 2 legs, with a steady, deliberate gait. "Is that a person in a suit?" someone whispered behind me. I shook my head slowly. No costume could mimic the natural way this creature moved. Its muscles rippled under the hair, powerful shoulders, thick arms hanging at its sides. Its head sat directly on those shoulders, no neck visible from where we stood. The creature stopped at the river's edge, about 25 yards from us. It turned slowly, facing our group directly. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the rushing of the river between us. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably about 5 minutes, we stared at each other across the water. It made no aggressive moves. It didn't pound its chest or roar like in the movies. It just watched us, and we watched it. More firefighters emerged from their tents, drawn by the silence. Someone flicked on a flashlight, then another. The beams cut through the growing darkness, and I caught a glimpse of the creature's eyes. They reflected the light like a deer's would, but there was something else there, something that looked like curiosity. The creature's head tilted slightly, examining us as we examined it. I felt frozen in place, not out of fear exactly, but from sheer amazement. Here was something that wasn't supposed to exist, something I'd heard about in campfire stories but never believed was real. Then Billy stepped forward with a more powerful light, aiming it directly at the creature. The spell broke instantly. The being turned with surprising speed and darted into the trees, but it didn't crash through the underbrush like a panicked animal. It moved with purpose, with intelligence. I watched in awe as it took long, powerful strides up the hillside. "Holy shit," Mike breathed beside me. What happened next still haunts my dreams. As the creature moved uphill through the dense forest, it didn't break branches or push through gaps like a human would. Instead, it simply moved small trees out of its way, not snapping them, just bending them aside with incredible strength. The trees swayed in its wake, marking its path up the mountainside like a living trail. We caught one final glimpse of it in a clearing, silhouetted against the darkening sky, before it disappeared completely into the forest. Not once did it make a sound. No yelling, no screaming, nothing but the soft rustle of vegetation as it passed. For several minutes after it vanished, nobody spoke. We all just stood there, staring at the empty hillside. Finally, Captain Ramirez cleared his throat. "All right, show's over. Back to camp, everyone." People began to move, talking in hushed, excited voices. "Did you see how big it was?" "It looked right at me, I swear." "Sasquatch. Had to be." I remained at the riverbank, unable to tear my eyes away from the spot where the creature had stood. Billy came up beside me, his face solemn. "Told you these woods were different," he said quietly. "You've seen one before?" I asked. He shook his head. "No, but my uncle did. Back in '87. No one believed him." He paused. "No one's going to believe us either." He was right. By morning, the excitement had already begun to fade. Some crew members were convinced it was a bear standing unusually. Others suggested it might have been another firefighter from a different crew, though nobody could explain the hair or the height. Captain Ramirez called a meeting before breakfast. "Listen up," he said, his voice stern. "I know what we all think we saw yesterday, but we're here to fight fires, not chase fairy tales. So let's focus on our job and leave the forest stories for when we get home." Most nodded in agreement, eager to avoid ridicule, but I noticed Billy and a few others exchange knowing glances. They'd seen what I'd seen. They knew. That day passed slowly. We were finally called to assist with mop-up operations on the main fire, which kept us busy but didn't stop the whispers. By nightfall, we returned to the same camp by the river. I couldn't help glancing across the water every few minutes, hoping for another glimpse. "It won't come back," said Jesse Thompson, a firefighter from Montana who'd been quiet since the sighting. "Not with all of us watching for it now." "You believe it was real then?" I asked. Jesse nodded. "My grandmother was half Blackfoot. She used to tell me stories about the tall ones who lived in the deep forests. Said they were here long before us and would be here long after we're gone. Why haven't more people seen them?" "Maybe they have," she replied. "Maybe they just don't talk about it because no one would believe them." That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my tent, listening to the forest sounds. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch had me sitting upright. Around 2 a.m., I gave up and stepped outside. The camp was quiet. A half moon provided just enough light to see by. I walked to the edge of the river and sat on a rock, watching the dark shapes of trees on the opposite bank. For over an hour, I sat there alone with my thoughts. The forest remained still. No massive figures emerged from the trees. No trees swayed unnaturally. Just the river flowing and occasional hoots of an owl. As I turned to head back to my tent, a sound stopped me. Not loud, just different from the natural forest noises. A soft knocking, like wood on wood. 3 distinct taps, then silence. I froze, scanning the darkness. The sound came again from further up the river. 3 taps, deliberate, then silence. I waited, barely breathing. After a minute, 3 more taps answered from the opposite direction, further downstream. My heart pounded in my chest. I wanted to call out to the others, to wake someone, anyone, to verify what I was hearing. But I remained silent, afraid that any noise would stop whatever communication was happening around me. The exchange continued, 3 taps upstream, 3 taps downstream, for about 10 minutes. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I waited another half hour, but the forest had returned to its normal sounds. Finally, cold and tired, I returned to my tent. I didn't mention the knocking to anyone the next day. Some things felt too personal, too sacred to share. 3 days later, our assignment ended. The Del Loma fire was fully contained, and we were released to return home. As we packed up camp, I took one last look across the river. "Goodbye," I whispered, not really sure why. On the bus ride home, the sighting became just another story, something to tell around future campfires. Some of the crew had already begun embellishing what they'd seen, making the creature larger, more aggressive. I stayed quiet, keeping my own memories intact. When we reached the reservation, my grandmother was waiting for me. She took one look at my face and knew something had happened. "You've seen something," she said, as we drove home in her old pickup truck. I nodded, unsure how to begin. "The old ones," she said, not a question but a statement. "The tall people of the forest." I stared at her. "How did you know?" She smiled, keeping her eyes on the dusty road. "The forest has many children, Sandra. Some it shows to us, some it keeps hidden. Why would it show itself to me? To us? Perhaps it was curious. Perhaps it was checking on the fire, same as you." She glanced at me. "Or perhaps it was measuring you, seeing what kind of person you are." That thought stayed with me. Had the creature been assessing us? Judging our reaction? Testing to see if we were a threat? I've been on dozens of fire assignments since that September in 2003. I've worked in forests across the country, from the Rockies to the Appalachians. I've never seen another Sasquatch, but sometimes, when I'm alone in the deep woods, I hear those 3 deliberate taps, and sometimes I tap back. I don't expect anyone to believe my story. That's not why I tell it. I tell it because that day by the river taught me something important. The natural world is bigger, stranger, and more wonderful than we allow ourselves to believe. There are creatures sharing this earth with us that have remained hidden, watching us from the shadows as we reshape their world. The Sasquatch I saw wasn't a monster. It was timid despite its size, cautious, intelligent. It observed us with what looked like the same curiosity we felt toward it. That's the part the movies and sensationalized stories get wrong. These beings aren't looking to attack or terrorize. They're just living their lives, staying out of our way, watching as we encroach further into their territories. 18 years have passed since that encounter. I'm still a firefighter, though now I lead my own crew. Sometimes when we're setting up camp in remote areas, I choose spots near rivers, and sometimes I pitch my tent a little apart from the others, just in case something tall and curious comes to the water's edge to look at the strange humans who visit its forest, just in case it wants to be seen again. Story 5. "I don't like this spot," Maria said, as we pulled into the campsite at Trinity River Campground. It was March 17th, 1996, still cold up in Trinity County, California, maybe around 45 degrees when the sun went down. Most folks wait until May to camp up here, but I'd gotten a bonus at work, and we figured a quick weekend getaway would do us good. "It's just the spot we reserved, honey," I told her, checking the map against our site number. "Besides, look at that view of the river." Maria nodded but frowned at the tree line on the far side of our site. "It's so exposed to the woods." I chuckled. "That's kind of the point of camping." I started unloading our gear from the back of the truck. Together we set up our 8-man dome tent, oversized for just the two of us, but comfortable. We staked it properly, making sure the rainfly was secure, even though the forecast was clear. We'd been caught in unexpected mountain rain before. "I'll zip it up," Maria said after we'd organized our sleeping bags and pillows inside. I heard the distinctive sound of the zipper sealing our belongings away from critters. We still had plenty of daylight, so we hiked a short trail along the Trinity River. The water rushed by, still swollen from winter melt. The forest smelled clean and crisp, pine needles crunching underfoot. But every so often I caught a whiff of something else, something rank that made my nose wrinkle. "You smell that?" I asked Maria after the third time it hit me. "Yeah, probably just a dead animal somewhere off trail," she replied, but her pace quickened. "Let's get back to camp." The smell disappeared as quickly as it had come. By the time we returned to our campsite, my stomach was growling. "Want to drive into Lewiston for dinner?" I suggested. "Too late to start a proper campfire meal." It was nearly 8 p.m. when we climbed into our truck and headed to the only diner in Lewiston that stayed open past 7. Nothing fancy, just burgers and fries, but it hit the spot. We chatted with the waitress, a local named Darlene, with grainy hands and a kind smile. "Staying up at Trinity?" she asked while refilling our coffee cups. "Just for the weekend," Maria answered. "Brave souls, camping this early in the season." Darlene chuckled. "Not many folks up there right now." "We noticed," I said. "Campground's pretty empty." Darlene nodded. "Well, enjoy the peace and quiet. Just keep your food locked up tight. Bears are waking up hungry." We paid our bill around 10 p.m. and drove back through the winding mountain roads. Our headlights caught the reflective eyes of a deer watching us from the roadside. The night was pitch black away from town, the kind of darkness city folks forget exists. "Got the flashlight ready?" I asked as we pulled into our campsite. The truck's headlights illuminated our sight, and I slammed on the brakes. "What the hell?" Maria gasped. Our tent was knocked over, contents spilled out across the dirt. Sleeping bags, pillows, clothes, everything we'd carefully organized now strewn about like garbage. "Did we not stake it properly?" Maria asked, but I could hear the doubt in her voice. We both knew we had. I put the truck in park, keeping the headlights aimed at our destroyed campsite. "There's no wind tonight, not even a breeze." We got out cautiously. I grabbed the mag light from the glove compartment and swept its beam across the scene. The tent poles had snapped in places, fabric torn. But what bothered me most was the tent entrance, wide open. I distinctly remembered Maria zipping it closed before we left. "Stephen, check if anything's missing," Maria said, her voice tight with controlled fear. We sifted through our belongings, clothes, toiletries, food cooler, all accounted for, though scattered. "Probably just some local kids," I said, not quite believing it myself. "Saw we were gone and decided to mess with us." Maria nodded, but her eyes kept darting to the dark tree line. "Let's just go find a hotel in town. I don't want to sleep here tonight." "Yeah, good call." We began gathering our things, working quickly. Maria took an armful of pillows to the truck, while I rolled up sleeping bags. I heard the truck door open, then close partially. The interior light went out. "Stephen," Maria called, her voice unnaturally calm. "As fast as you can, please just get to the car with the keys." My blood turned to ice. Years ago, we'd established this as our code phrase for serious danger. No questions, no hesitation, just move. I dropped everything and sprinted to the truck, keys already in my hand. Maria was in the passenger seat, face pale. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine in one fluid motion. "Drive," she whispered. I peeled out of the campsite, tires kicking up dirt. We didn't speak until we reached the campground entrance, about a quarter-mile away. I pulled over, hands shaking on the wheel. "What did you see?" I asked, scanning the rearview mirror. Maria took a deep breath. "When I was loading the pillows, I saw something move at the edge of the headlights, maybe 15 feet away. I thought it was a deer at first, so I closed the door enough to kill the interior light and looked closer." She swallowed hard. "It stood up, Stephen. It stood up on two legs and walked toward the river. I only saw it for maybe 2 seconds, but it was big, brown. I saw its back and left shoulder clearly. It wasn't human, but it moved like one." "A bear," I suggested, knowing how unlikely that was. Maria shook her head firmly. "Bears don't stand and walk like that. And remember that smell we kept noticing earlier? It wasn't a dead animal." The realization hit me, that rank odor, like wet animal fur mixed with something rotten. A smell that came and went as if carried on a breeze that didn't exist. "We need to get our stuff," I said after a moment. "Are you crazy? I'm not going back there. We can't just leave everything. Look, I'll drive back with the high beams on. We'll stay in the truck, grab our stuff fast, and get out." Maria reluctantly agreed. I turned the truck around and drove slowly back to our site, high beams cutting through the darkness. I scanned the tree line, the riverside, every shadow. Nothing moved. "I don't see anything," I said. "It was there," Maria insisted, "right by that big pine with the branch hanging over the clearing." I looked where she pointed. The branch she mentioned was at least 8 feet off the ground. Whatever she'd seen was tall. We worked like people possessed, throwing our belongings into the truck bed without organizing anything. The tent was damaged beyond quick repair, so we just collapsed it and stuffed it in too. The whole time, I felt eyes on my back, watching from the darkness beyond our lights. We drove straight to Reading, about 30 miles away, and checked into the first hotel we saw. Neither of us slept well. Every creak of the building, every distant slam of a door jolted us awake. The next morning, over coffee in the hotel lobby, I suggested going back. "I want to see the site in daylight," I explained. "Take some pictures." "Why?" Maria asked, stirring her coffee. "Because if what you saw was what I think it was, we should document it." Maria stared at me. "You think I saw a Sasquatch?" I didn't answer right away. I'd always been skeptical about Bigfoot stories, but the destroyed tent, the open zipper, the smell, and most importantly what Maria saw, it all fit the accounts I'd read. "I think you saw something that shouldn't exist," I finally said, "and I want to know what it was." We drove back around noon, camera in hand. The campsite looked less threatening in daylight, but no less disturbed. Our hasty packing had left trash behind, food wrappers and a forgotten sock. I gathered these while Maria stood by the truck, refusing to venture far from it. I walked to the pine tree Maria had pointed out and studied the ground. The soil was soft from recent rain, and there, partially obscured by pine needles, was a depression in the earth. Not a footprint, but a large area where something heavy had been squatting. "It was watching us," I called to Maria. "It was right here, watching us unpack before we left for dinner." "Can we go now?" Maria asked, her voice tight. "Just a minute." I remembered something I'd read about Sasquatch encounters, reports of trackways near sightings. I walked up the gravel road about a quarter-mile, scanning the edges where it met the forest. Near a drainage ditch, the soil was muddy, and there they were, footprints. Not the rounded paws of a bear, but elongated impressions with 5 distinct toe marks. They were huge, easily 16 inches long. I pressed my boot into the mud nearby for comparison. My print was maybe half the depth of the mystery tracks, despite me weighing 150 pounds and jumping slightly to increase the impression. I took photos of everything: the campsite, the tree, the depression in the ground, and the footprints. Then we left, neither of us suggesting we stay another night. On the drive home, Maria finally spoke about what she'd seen in more detail. "It wasn't like the pictures you see in tabloids," she said. "No big head, no pointed features, just massive. The shoulders were so broad, and even from behind I could tell the arms were long, too long." "Why do you think it went through our tent?" I asked. Maria considered this. Curiosity? Or maybe it smelled our food. We had those granola bars in my backpack. But it didn't take anything. Maybe we came back too soon. Or maybe it was just curious about us, our things. 3 days after we returned home, I got the photos developed. The campsite pictures came out fine, showing our demolished tent. The tree and the depression where the creature had squatted were visible but unremarkable on film. The footprints, however, were unmistakable. Massive impressions that no known animal in Trinity County could have made. I called the Trinity County Sheriff's Department, feeling somewhat foolish. The deputy who answered listened politely to my story. "So you didn't actually see this creature yourself?" he clarified. "No, but my wife did, and our campsite was destroyed. Mr. Kendrick, we get reports of bears and vandalism in the campgrounds all the time, without more evidence." "I have photographs of footprints," I interrupted. "Footprints that aren't human or bear." A long pause followed. "Sir, if you'd like to file a formal report, you're welcome to come in. But I should warn you, unless there's property damage exceeding $500 or personal injury, there's not much we can do." I thanked him and hung up, understanding the subtext. They thought we were either lying or confused, city folks spooked by wildlife or teenagers. But Maria and I knew what happened. In the weeks that followed, I researched Sasquatch sightings in Trinity County and found dozens of reports dating back decades, many describing the same details we experienced: the smell, the destroyed campsites, the massive footprints. We never camped in Trinity County again. We still go camping, but now we choose established campgrounds with plenty of neighbors and activities. Places where the tree line doesn't seem to watch you, and where strange smells are just skunks or campfire smoke. Sometimes at night, I wake up thinking I smell that rank odor again, damp fur and decay. I tell myself it's just a bad dream. But then I remember the photos in my desk drawer, especially one showing my boot print next to that massive footprint. My impression is a shallow dent. The creature's print sinks deep into the earth, pressed by weight I can't comprehend. Whatever watched us from the woods that night in Trinity County was real. It walked on 2 legs, stood over 7 feet tall, and moved silently enough to destroy our tent without a single camper in the vicinity hearing a thing. It left us physically unharmed, but it took something from us anyway. The comfort of believing we know what's out there in the dark. Story 6. I never believed in monsters. Not the kind that hide under beds or lurk in closets, and certainly not the kind that supposedly roam the deep forests of the Pacific Northwest. But that was before June 1995, before Bridge Camp, before everything I thought I knew about this world got turned inside out. My name's Mark Wilson. I'm from Elkridge, a small town where most folks make their living from timber or tourism. I've spent my whole life in and around the forests of the West Coast, considered myself pretty damn knowledgeable about what's out there. Turns out, I didn't know shit. It started as just another camping trip. Me and 3 buddies, Dale, Lenny, and Tim, decided to head up to Trinity County for some fishing and drinking. Simple enough. We'd done it dozens of times before. The spot we picked was about 3 miles from the trailhead, a well-used clearing called Bridge Camp that sits next to the river. Good fishing, Nice flat spots for tents, fire ring already built. Perfect. We hiked in Friday afternoon, June 16th. Weather was good. Clear skies, temperatures in the high 70s. The trail wasn't difficult, just a steady uphill through dense forest with occasional glimpses of the river down below. We reached the camp around 4:30, plenty of time to set up before dark. Dale and I pitched our tent near the edge of the clearing, while Tim and Lenny took the spot closer to the trail. We collected firewood, filtered some water, and started cooking dinner as the sun began to set. Nothing unusual, just 4 guys sitting around a campfire, drinking beer, telling bullshit stories. The same camping trip we'd done 100 times before. Until about 9:30 that night. I was sitting on a thick log we'd pulled up to the fire, just sipping my beer and watching the flames, when I first heard it. A low, rumbling sound from down the hill toward the river. At first, I thought it might be the water, but the tone was all wrong. It sounded like voices, deep voices, mumbling something I couldn't make out. "You guys hear that?" I asked, keeping my voice low. Tim looked up from poking the fire. "Hear what?" I raised my hand for quiet and pointed toward the river. "That. Listen." We all went still. The fire crackled. And then there it was again. Low, guttural sounds, almost like speech, but not quite. And something else, the distinct crack of large branches breaking. "Probably just some other campers," Lenny said, but he didn't sound convinced. 3 miles in, and we didn't pass anyone on the trail? I shook my head. "And that doesn't sound like people talking." Dale laughed nervously. "Well, what the hell else would it be, Mark?" I didn't answer. The noises were getting closer, moving up from the riverbank toward our camp. And they were changing. The low mumbling had shifted to higher pitches, almost like whatever was making them was surprised or unsure. It reminded me of when you walk into a room and people stop talking, then start whispering. "It's just the river echoing off the canyon walls," Tim said, reaching for another beer. "Sound does weird shit out here." I might have believed him except for what happened next. The sound stopped completely. 1 second, there was this weird murmuring coming through the trees, and the next, dead silence. Not just the voices, everything. No insects chirping, no rustling leaves, no nightbirds, nothing. The sudden quiet made the hair on my arms stand up. I scanned the tree line, squinting past the firelight that was killing my night vision. And that's when I saw them. Shadows. Large, tall shadows, moving between the trees at the edge of our camp. Not like animals on 4 legs, but upright. Bipedal. They were heading down toward a flat granite area by the river, just visible through a gap in the trees. "Guys," I whispered, not taking my eyes off the movement. "Look." Tim started to say something sarcastic, but Dale shushed him. We all watched as the shapes disappeared from view. For maybe 30 seconds nothing happened. I was starting to think I'd imagined it when the night exploded with sound. Boom! 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 The impacts shook the ground beneath us. I felt the log I was sitting on, a solid chunk of Douglas fir, at least 14 inches thick, physically bounce under me. It was supported by other logs about 7 feet apart, and the whole thing was moving. Along with the pounding came voices, not mumbling now, but loud rhythmic chanting. The sounds rose and fell in a pattern, multiple voices joining together in what I can only describe as a protest. The message didn't need translation. Get out. I looked at my friends. Tim's mouth hung open, his beer forgotten in his hand. Lenny had gone pale, his eyes wide. Dale was frozen, staring toward the river. "We need to leave," I said, already standing up. "Right now." "Leave," Lenny hissed. "It's pitch black. We can't hike out now." "Better than staying here with whatever the fuck that is," I countered. Tim shook his head. "It's probably just kids messing with us, or maybe rangers trying to scare us off for some reason." The stomping and chanting continued, getting more frenzied. The voices rose to an almost hysterical pitch. No human I've ever met could make sounds like that. Not that loud, not that raw, not that powerful. "Those aren't people," I said with absolute certainty. Dale finally spoke up. "Mark's right. We should pack up." Before we could move, the chaos stopped as suddenly as it had started. The last echoes faded into the night, leaving us in tense silence. Then came 3 deep hooded sounds, almost like orders being given, lower than the others, more controlled. After that, the voices trailed away, moving off into the distance. We sat frozen around the fire for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. "What the hell was that?" Lenny finally whispered. No one answered. What could we say? We'd all heard it. We'd all felt it. "Maybe we should try to sleep," Tim suggested eventually. "Keep the fire going. Leave at first light." I wasn't thrilled with the idea of staying, but hiking out in the dark seemed equally dangerous. What if we ran into whatever had made those sounds? At least here we had the fire, some visibility. "Fine," I agreed reluctantly, "but we sleep in shifts, 2 awake, 2 asleep." No one argued. We built the fire up as high as we dared. Then Tim and Lenny took the first watch, while Dale and I crawled into our tent. I didn't expect to sleep, but exhaustion and adrenaline crash pulled me under. I woke suddenly around 2 a.m. Dale was breathing steadily beside me, dead asleep. Outside, I heard Tim and Lenny talking quietly by the fire. Then a new sound caught my attention. Screaming. Distant, but unmistakable. It came from far up the valley, then moments later from the mountaintop across from us, as if whatever made the noise was traveling at impossible speed. I lay awake, listening until Lenny unzipped our tent around 3 a.m. "Your turn," he whispered. "Everything's been quiet for a while. Just those weird screams earlier." "Yeah, I heard those," I said, crawling out of my sleeping bag. "Wake Tim up. I'll get the coffee started." The rest of the night passed without incident. As dawn broke, I started to wonder if we'd overreacted. Maybe it had been other campers. Maybe the exhaustion of the hike had made us imagine things. Then I found the footprints. Not small indentations like human boots would leave, but deep potholes in the trail, spaced about 6 feet apart. Whatever had made them was heavy, far heavier than any person I've ever known, and near our fire pit, caught on a rough piece of bark, were several strands of hair, jet black with distinctive silver tips, too coarse for human hair, too long for any animal native to these woods. We packed up quickly after that, barely speaking as we broke camp. The 3-mile hike back to the trailhead felt like 30. Every snap of a twig made us jump. Every shadow between the trees looked menacing. When we finally reached the parking lot, we threw our gear in Dale's truck and got the hell out of there. It took weeks before any of us talked about what happened. When we finally did, sitting in Tim's garage with the door firmly closed, I expected at least one of them to rationalize it away. But they didn't. "It wasn't bears," Dale said quietly. "Bears don't chant." "It wasn't people either," Lenny added. "People can't move that fast from one mountain to another." Tim just nodded, staring at his beer. I told them about the footprints and the hair then. I'd kept it to myself, not wanting to freak them out more, but now it seemed important that they know. "I think we ran into a family of Sasquatch," I said, the words sounding ridiculous even as I spoke them. "I think they were migrating through the area, and we were camped right on their path." No one laughed. That's how I knew they believed it too. But there was more to the story. Something I never told them. Something that happened after they took first watch and I went to sleep. I don't know how long I'd been out when I woke to the sound of shuffling outside our tent. Dale was dead asleep beside me. Outside, I could hear Tim and Lenny's voices by the fire, so it wasn't them. The shuffling came closer, then stopped right outside the thin nylon wall near my head. I lay perfectly still, not even daring to breathe, as a massive shadow eclipsed the firelight that had been filtering through the tent. Whatever was out there squatted down directly in front of our tent flap. I could feel its breath pushing against the fabric, creating small indentations that pulsed in and out with each exhalation. A smell filled the air then, warm, musky, like wet dog and something else I couldn't identify. Not entirely unpleasant, but strong, wild. Then I saw it, the impression of 5 distinct digits pressing against the tent where the zipper was located. Not paws, fingers, large fingers, probing curiously at the zipper mechanism. I watched, paralyzed, as the zipper moved slightly, then stopped. The fingers withdrew. The breathing continued. I had the overwhelming sense that whatever was out there knew I was awake, knew I was aware of its presence. It wasn't trying to get in. It was investigating, curious. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only minutes, the shadow moved away. The breathing stopped. The presence retreated. I lay there until dawn, unable to move, unable to call out to Tim and Lenny, who somehow hadn't seen what happened. I've replayed that night in my mind thousands of times since then. The protests by the river, the screams across the valley, and most of all those 5 fingers on our tent, just inches from my face. Before bridge camp, I'd have laughed if you'd told me Sasquatch was real. Now, I'm not just a believer, I'm a witness. We encountered something in those woods that science says doesn't exist. Something that communicated, that traveled in a family group, that demonstrated intelligence, and even what seemed like a mischievous sense of humor. I haven't been camping since. The others haven't either. Some things change you forever, and knowing what's really out there in the deep woods is one of them. I don't tell this story often. Most people wouldn't believe it anyway. But it happened. June 1995, Trinity County, California. The night I learned that humans aren't the only intelligent species walking on 2 legs in the forests of America. And sometimes, when I can't sleep and the house is quiet, I swear I can still feel the rhythm of that pounding, still hear those primal voices rising through the trees, still sense those 5 curious fingers exploring the barrier between their world and mine. Story 7. The summer of 1954 was hot in Elkhorn City. That's what I remember most when I think back to those days, the sticky heat that clung to your skin like molasses, making your cotton dress stick to your back. My name's Lydia Morton, and I was 15 that summer. My sister Emma, just 13. We lived with our pa George and our older brother Thomas in a small house tucked into the hollow beneath Elkridge. Our house sat about 100 yards off the main road, which wasn't much more than a strip of uneven asphalt that wound through the mountains like a black snake. Just up that road was Jenkins' General Store, where we'd sometimes walk to get sodas on hot afternoons. It was July 17th. I remember the date because it was exactly 1 week before my birthday. Emma and I had just gotten our weekly allowance, 25 cents each, and we decided to splurge on ice-cold Coca-Colas at Jenkins. "Come on, Emma," I said, pulling my sister by the hand. "If we get there before 3, Mr. Jenkins might give us penny candy too." Emma giggled and followed me up the dusty path that connected our house to the road. The cicadas buzzed in the trees, making that constant droning sound that was the soundtrack to every Kentucky summer. The air smelled of pine and hot earth. Mr. Jenkins's store was a squat wooden building with a rusted tin roof and a front porch lined with rocking chairs for the old-timers who sat there chewing tobacco and telling lies. The screen door slapped shut behind us as we entered the cool dimness of the store. "Well, if it ain't the Morton girls," Mr. Jenkins said from behind the counter. He was a lean, weathered man with a bristly grey mustache and eyebrows so bushy they nearly covered his eyes. "What can I do for you ladies today?" "2 Coca-Colas, please," I said, placing our coins on the counter with a proud, clinking sound. He nodded and reached into the red cooler, pulling out 2 glass bottles, their sides sweating with condensation. He popped the caps off with the opener bolted to the counter's edge. "You girls want to drink those here or take 'em home?" he asked. "We'll sit outside if that's all right," I replied. Emma and I took our sodas and settled on the wooden bench outside the store. From that spot, we had a clear view of the ridge above our house. The mountain rose up steep and green, thick with oak and pine trees. But halfway up was an outcropping of grey rock that formed a natural overlook. Pa always said you could see clear to Virginia from up there on a clear day. We sat there sipping our Coca-Colas, letting the fizzy sweetness cool our throats. Emma was telling me about a book she'd been reading, something about horses, when she suddenly stopped mid-sentence. "Lydia," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "look up there." I followed her gaze up to the rocky outcropping above our house. At first I didn't see anything unusual, just the familiar jutting rock against the green mountainside. Then I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the overlook. "Is that a person?" I asked, squinting against the sun. The figure was tall, taller than any man I'd ever seen. It stood upright like a person, but something about it wasn't right. Even from this distance I could see it was covered in hair, dark brown or black hair that moved in the breeze. "What is that, Lydia?" Emma's voice trembled. The screen door slapped behind us as Mr. Jenkins stepped out onto the porch, wiping his hands on his apron. "You girls see something?" he asked, following our gaze. When he spotted the figure, he froze. "My God," he muttered. "It's the wild man." That's when Emma started crying, not loud sobbing but quiet, frightened tears that made her shoulders shake. I put my arm around her, but I couldn't look away from the creature on the ridge. It was watching us. I could feel its eyes on us, though I couldn't make out its face clearly. The hair on its body hung long, down to its shoulders. Where the sun hit it directly, I could see patches of skin showing through, light tan skin on what must have been its face and knees. Mr. Jenkins had gone very still beside us. "Don't make no sudden moves," he whispered. "Just stay real quiet." The three of us sat there, frozen, for what felt like hours, but was probably only a minute or two. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature turned away. It moved with a smooth, rolling gait, not like a man and not like an animal either, but something in between. It walked along the old mining hall road that curved around the ridge, stopping once to look back at us before disappearing into the thick trees. Emma was still crying. Mr. Jenkins put a hand on her shoulder. "It's gone now, girl," he said. "No need to fret." But his face was pale, and his hand trembled slightly as he reached for his pipe. "You girls best get on home now. Tell your pa what you saw." We left our half-finished sodas on the bench and hurried down the road toward our house. Emma clung to my hand, her palms sweaty with fear. "What was it, Lydia?" she kept asking. "What did we see?" "I don't know," I answered truthfully. "But Pa will know what to do." Pa and Thomas weren't due back from the lumberyard where they worked until 5 o'clock. When we got home, we locked the doors, something we rarely did during daylight hours, and sat in the kitchen watching the clock's hands crawl toward 5. At 10 minutes past 5, we heard the familiar rumble of Pa's truck coming up the drive. Emma and I ran out onto the porch to meet them. "Pa, Thomas," I called out. "Something happened." Pa cut the engine and stepped out of the truck. He was a big man with broad shoulders and hands rough from years of hard work. Thomas followed, looking concerned at our obvious distress. "What's the matter, girls?" Pa asked, his brow furrowed. "We saw something on the ridge," I said, the words tumbling out. "A creature. Mr. Jenkins called it a wild man." Pa and Thomas exchanged a look. "Show me where," Pa said, his voice calm but serious. We walked to the edge of our yard, and I pointed up to the rocky outcropping. It was standing right there, watching us. It was tall, Pa, and covered in hair. Dark hair, Emma added, like the color of wet bark. Thomas had already gone into the house and come back with Pa's Winchester rifle. Pa took it from him without a word. "You girls stay here with your brother," he said. "I'm going to check it out." "I'm coming with you," Thomas insisted. Pa looked like he might argue, but then he nodded. "All right, Lydia, you and Emma go inside and lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but us." We did as we were told, watching from the kitchen window as Pa and Thomas climbed the steep path that led up the ridge. They grew smaller and smaller until they were just tiny figures moving through the trees. "What if it gets them?" Emma whispered, her face pressed against the glass. "It won't," I said with more confidence than I felt. "Pa knows these woods better than anyone." The sun was starting to set when Pa and Thomas finally returned. We rushed to unlock the door for them. "Did you find it?" I asked. Pa shook his head. "No tracks we could make sense of. Ground's too hard and rocky up there." Thomas set the rifle in its usual place by the door. We saw where something had disturbed the brush along the mining road, but could have been a deer or bear. Pa sat heavily at the kitchen table. "Tell me again exactly what you saw." We described the creature in as much detail as we could, its height, the dark hair covering its body, the way it moved. "And Mr. Jenkins saw it too?" Pa asked. I nodded. "He called it a wild man." Pa was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Then he said, "Remember those biscuits that went missing the other day?" 3 days earlier, Ma's homemade biscuits had disappeared from the kitchen counter, 12 of them, still warm from the oven. Pa had accused us of taking them, but Emma and I had denied it. Thomas, too. Pa had been angry, thinking one of us was lying. "You think this thing took our biscuits?" Thomas asked, sounding skeptical. "Something came into this house," Pa said firmly, "and it wasn't any of you kids, was it?" We all shook our heads. "The back door was unlocked that day," Pa continued. "Something could have walked right in while we were all out at the garden." The thought of that creature entering our house made my skin crawl. I could tell from Emma's face that she felt the same. "From now on, we keep the doors locked," Pa said, "day and night, and this stays loaded." He patted the rifle. That night, I lay in bed listening to the sounds of the mountain outside our window. Every creak of a branch, every rustle of leaves made me tense up. Emma had crawled into my bed, something she hadn't done since she was 8. "Do you think it'll come back?" she whispered in the darkness. "No," I lied. "Pa scared it off for good." But I lay awake for hours, wondering what was out there in the darkness of the Kentucky mountains. The next morning, Pa drove down to the county sheriff's office to report what we'd seen. The sheriff, a fat man named Bigfoot Tate, who spent most of his time giving speeding tickets to out-of-towners, listened to Pa's story with obvious disbelief. "Sounds like you got yourself a bear problem, George," he said, according to Pa. "Or maybe the girls saw a man hunting up there. Could have been wearing one of them ghillie suits." Pa didn't argue. He knew how it sounded. Word spread quickly through Elkhorn City about the wild man sighting. Some folks believed us, especially the old-timers who had stories of their own about strange creatures in these mountains. Others laughed it off, suggesting we'd seen a bear standing on its hind legs or a hunter in camouflage. Mr. Jenkins stood by what he'd seen. "Weren't no bear," he told anyone who'd listen at his store. "Walked like a man, but weren't no man I ever seen." We didn't see the creature again that summer, or ever after. Pa kept the doors locked for months afterward. He checked the yard before letting us out to play, and he made sure one of the men of the house was always home with us girls. Thomas took to exploring the ridge on weekends, looking for evidence of the creature. He never found anything conclusive, just the occasional strange footprint that could have belonged to anything, or broken branches high up where no man could reach. Years later, in the late 1960s, we started hearing stories on the news about something called Bigfoot being spotted in California. When I saw the grainy film footage they showed on TV of a large, hairy creature walking through the woods, I felt a chill run down my spine. It moved just like what we'd seen that day on the ridge. "That's it," I told Emma, who was visiting with her new husband. "That's what we saw." She nodded, her face solemn. "I dream about it sometimes still," she admitted, standing there watching us. Pa never liked us talking about it much, especially after Ma died in '67. I think it bothered him that he couldn't protect us from whatever it was. But sometimes, when he'd had a few drinks on the porch in the evening, he'd talk about it. Whatever it was, he'd say, staring up at the darkening ridge. It knew enough to come inside for food rather than hunting. And it knew enough to leave when it was spotted. That's more smarts than any animal I know. Thomas stayed in Elkhorn City his whole life, eventually taking over Pa's job at the lumberyard. He never stopped looking for evidence of what we'd seen, becoming something of a local expert on Bigfoot sightings in eastern Kentucky. He kept a file of newspaper clippings about similar sightings in the region, some dating back to the early 1900s. I moved away to Lexington in 1960, got married, had kids of my own, but I never forgot that day. Sometimes when I visit home and look up at that rocky outcropping, I can still see it standing there, watching. I still check that the doors are locked at night, no matter where I am. The mountains of eastern Kentucky hold their secrets close. Whatever we saw that summer day in 1954 remains one of them. But I know what I saw, and so does Emma, and so did Mr. Jenkins, who went to his grave in 1978 still telling people about the wild man of Elkridge. Some folks still ask me about it when they find out I'm one of the Morton girls who saw the creature. I tell them the truth. It was tall, covered in dark hair, with patches of light skin showing through. It walked upright like a man, but wasn't a man. And for a brief moment on a hot summer day, it stood on that ridge and looked down at us, as curious about us as we were terrified of it. Then it turned and walked away, back into the deep forests and hidden hollows of the mountains, where, for all I know, it remains to this day. Story 8. I gripped the steering wheel tighter as my headlights cut through the evening darkness on Highway 12. The clock on my dashboard read 10:43 p.m. as I headed home after a long day at the research facility outside Walla Walla. October 14th, 2005, a date that would divide my life into before and after. My name is David Nesdeby. I was 37 years old, had a PhD in agricultural sciences, and believed I understood how the world worked. I'd spent the evening finalizing data for our soil composition study. The kind of work that earns respectful nods at academic conferences but glazed eyes at dinner parties. Normal work, real work, the kind that follows rules. The radio played low, some call-in show about politics, and my thoughts drifted to the weekend plans with my wife Hannah. Maybe we'd drive up to Spokane, visit that brewery she'd been talking about. That's when I first saw it in the distance, maybe 300 yards ahead. Damn, I muttered, squinting at what looked like a large piece of industrial plastic caught in the wind, hovering above the power lines that ran parallel to the highway, probably blown from a construction site or farm. I eased off the accelerator slightly, not wanting to hit whatever it was if it blew across the road. But as I got closer, the object didn't move like plastic in wind. It didn't flutter or twist. It floated deliberately. I slowed my Ford F-150 to 40 miles per hour, then 30. The shape began to take form in my headlights, dark, solid, and perfectly controlled in its movement. It hovered above the power lines, not touching them, not affected by the light breeze I'd felt earlier when I'd stopped for gas. "What the hell?" I whispered as I drew within 100 yards. That's when I saw it clearly for the first time. The shape was humanoid. Large, at least 7 feet tall, but it wasn't human. The proportions were wrong. Longer arms, a sloped head that seemed to sit directly on massive shoulders. It was covered in what appeared to be dark hair or fur. My truck came to a complete stop in the middle of the empty highway. I killed the headlights instinctively, as if I were watching wildlife that might spook. My hands trembled as I fumbled for the door handle, then pushed it open. The cool night air hit my face as I stepped out onto the asphalt. The creature, because that's what it undeniably was, floated approximately 20 feet above the power lines. It moved slowly, deliberately, like someone walking underwater. There was no visible means of propulsion, no wings, no jetpack. Nothing that could explain how a massive, apparently solid being was suspended in mid-air. As I watched, it drifted directly over the highway about 50 yards ahead of me, continuing its northward trajectory across an open field. My scientific brain kicked into overdrive. This violated everything I knew about physics, biology, and the natural world. It couldn't be real. Yet my eyes registered every detail with painful clarity. The bulk of its shoulders, the way its arms hung at its sides, the distinctive profile that reminded me of something I'd seen before but couldn't immediately place. I jumped back into my truck, fired up the engine, and pulled a U-turn. If this thing was heading north, I could cut across to Smith Road and potentially intercept its path. I needed a closer look. I needed to confirm what I was seeing. I sped down Highway 12 for half a mile until I reached the turnoff, then raced down Smith Road with my windows down, scanning the night sky. The rational part of my brain screamed that I was chasing a hallucination, that I needed sleep, or maybe a psychiatric evaluation. But I knew what I'd seen. After about 2 miles, I pulled over onto the shoulder and cut the engine. The night was quiet except for distant traffic and the faint buzz of the power lines. I stepped out again, my boots crunching on gravel as I walked to the center of the road. I turned in a complete circle, searching. There, coming from the east, the same figure, floating about 30 feet above the ground, moving directly toward me now. My throat went dry, my heart hammered against my ribs. As it drew closer, I could make out more details, and that's when the recognition finally clicked. The profile, the proportions, the massive frame covered in what looked like dark fur. It resembled descriptions and images of Sasquatch or Bigfoot. But Bigfoot doesn't fly. Bigfoot can't float above power lines. Bigfoot isn't real. Yet there it was, less than 100 yards away now, and coming straight toward me. I stood frozen in the middle of the road. Running seemed pointless. If this thing wanted to catch me, it clearly could. So I waited, my breath coming in shallow gasps as the impossible creature approached. At 50 yards, I noticed something else. The being was carrying something in its arms, something limp. As it drifted closer, the moonlight revealed what appeared to be a medium-sized dog, completely motionless. Dead or unconscious, I couldn't tell. At 30 yards, I could see its face. That's when all doubt vanished. The face was not human, but it wasn't an animal either. The heavy brow ridge shadowed deep-set eyes. The nose was flat and wide. The jaw was pronounced with a slight underbite. But the eyes held intelligence, awareness, purpose. Those eyes locked onto mine. I felt seen, truly seen, not just observed, but recognized, acknowledged. There was a consciousness behind those eyes that registered my presence with the same shock I felt at its existence. For 3 seconds, the longest 3 seconds of my life, we stared at each other, separated by 30 yards of country road and everything I had believed about reality. Then, without any change in speed or apparent effort, the creature altered its course. It veered west, away from the road, carrying its lifeless burden. I watched, rooted to the spot, as it floated over a field of harvested wheat and eventually disappeared into a grove of trees in the distance. I don't know how long I stood there. Minutes, maybe. The cold eventually cut through my shock, and I became aware of my surroundings again. A pickup truck approached from the south, its headlights bringing me back to reality. I stumbled to the side of the road as it passed, the driver giving me a curious look. I returned to my truck and sat behind the wheel, my hands shaking so badly I couldn't get the key in the ignition. I took several deep breaths, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. Flying Sasquatch. The words sounded ridiculous even in my head, yet I had seen it. Clear as day, no alcohol in my system, no history of hallucinations, no reason to doubt my own eyes. I finally managed to start the truck and drive home. Hannah was already asleep when I got there. I sat at our kitchen table until dawn, making notes, drawing what I'd seen, trying to find some explanation that made sense. The next morning, I called in sick to work. I spent the day researching Sasquatch sightings online, looking for anything similar to what I'd experienced. Most reports described ground-based encounters, creatures walking through forests, crossing roads, leaving footprints. Nothing about flying or floating. When Hannah left for her shift at the hospital, I made my first call to a Bigfoot research organization based in Seattle. The man who answered had the enthusiastic tone of someone who'd been waiting for calls like mine. Bigfoot Research Institute, this is Gary. Hi, Gary. My name is David Nesdeby. I'm a researcher at the Agricultural Extension in Walla Walla. I think I saw something last night that you might be interested in. A sighting? Excellent. Where was this located? I described the location along Highway 12 and on Smith Road. Great, Gary said. Now tell me what you observed. I hesitated, already hearing how it would sound. I saw what appeared to be a Sasquatch-like creature, large, covered in dark hair or fur. But it was floating above the power lines, moving through the air without any visible means of propulsion. The enthusiasm in Gary's voice disappeared. Floating? You mean it was jumping? No, it was definitely floating, moving horizontally through the air, about 20 to 30 feet above the ground. There was a long pause. Sir, we're serious researchers here. We document actual Sasquatch encounters. If you want to report a UFO or some kind of supernatural experience, there are other organizations for that. I'm not making this up, I said, my voice rising. I'm a scientist. I know what I saw. Look, Mr. Nesdeby, Sasquatch are biological creatures. They don't fly. If you want to classify your sighting as a humanoid encounter for the paranormal folks, that's fine, but it's not a Bigfoot sighting. The call ended shortly after. I tried 2 more organizations with similar results. One person even laughed before hanging up. By the end of the week, I'd given up on reporting my experience through official channels. Instead, I began my own research. I ordered every book I could find on Sasquatch. I joined online forums. I searched newspaper archives for similar accounts. And eventually, I found them. Not many, maybe a dozen scattered reports over the past 50 years, but enough to know I wasn't alone. A logger in Northern California in 1976 described a flying ape man crossing a valley. A family in British Columbia in 1998 reported a floating Sasquatch carrying a dead coyote. A hunter in eastern Oregon in 2002 claimed to have seen a Bigfoot hovering above the tree line at dusk. These accounts had been dismissed, ridiculed, or reclassified as something else. UFO encounters, hallucinations, hoaxes. But I recognized the truth in them because I had seen it myself. 3 weeks after my sighting, I returned to the area for the first time. The daylight revealed nothing unusual, just power lines running alongside the highway, open fields, scattered farms. I parked where I'd first stopped and walked the roadside, looking for any physical evidence. I found nothing. I drove to Smith Road and walked along the path where the creature had veered west. In a small grove of trees about a quarter mile from the road, I found something unusual. A circular area about 15 feet in diameter where the ground vegetation appeared crushed, as if something heavy had landed there. The surrounding trees showed no broken branches or disturbance. At the center of the circle, I discovered what looked like animal fur and dried blood on some fallen leaves. I collected samples in plastic bags, labeling them carefully. Later, I'd have a veterinarian friend examine them unofficially. The fur came from a domestic dog, a golden retriever mix. The blood was canine as well. That night, Hannah found me at the kitchen table, surrounded by my research materials. "David, what's going on with you?" she asked, concern etching her face. "You've barely slept in weeks. You're distracted all the time. Is everything okay at work?" I looked up at her, my wife of 12 years, the person who knew me better than anyone. "If I tell you something that sounds completely insane, would you at least try to believe that I believe it?" She sat down across from me, her nurse's eyes evaluating my physical state. Of course. So I told her everything, the sighting, the research, the samples. I showed her my sketches and notes. I pointed out the similar reports I'd found. When I finished, she didn't immediately respond. She looked at my materials, flipped through my notebook, and finally met my eyes. "You really saw this," she said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes." "And it's changed everything for you?" "Yes." She reached across the table and took my hand. "Then I believe you believe it. That's enough for now." It wasn't full acceptance, but it was something. Someone willing to acknowledge that I wasn't crazy, even if they couldn't yet accept what I'd seen was real. 6 months later, I took a leave of absence from my research position to pursue Sasquatch research full-time. Hannah didn't understand, but she supported me as best she could. We agreed on a 1-year timeline. If I hadn't made significant progress by then, I'd return to my regular work. I spent that year interviewing witnesses, hiking through reported hotspots, and connecting with the few researchers who would take my account seriously. I learned to distinguish between the mainstream Bigfoot community, those looking for a large, undiscovered primate, and the smaller subset of researchers who believed Sasquatch might be something else entirely, something that didn't fit neatly into our understanding of biology or physics. I never saw the flying Sasquatch again, but I collected 7 first-hand accounts from others who had. Each description matched key details of my own experience: the deliberate movement, the lack of visible means of propulsion, the apparent weight and solidity of the creature despite its defiance of gravity. One witness, a retired forest ranger named Bill Matlock from northern Idaho, became a close friend and research partner. He'd seen a similar creature in 1987 while working in the Clearwater National Forest. "It changes you," he told me during our first meeting at a diner in Lewiston. "Seeing something like that, it's not just that you believe in Sasquatch now, it's that you have to question everything else too. If this is possible, what else might be out there that we've been told is impossible?" That was the crux of it. My sighting hadn't just made me a believer in Bigfoot, it had transformed me from a skeptic to what I now call a knower, someone who has directly experienced something that fundamentally alters their understanding of reality. The world didn't change. I did. Every sunrise, every scientific paper I read, every conversation about what is or isn't possible, all of it now existed in the shadow of what I knew to be true, but couldn't prove to others. At the end of my year of research, I returned to my position at the agricultural extension. I continued my Sasquatch research on weekends and evenings. Hannah and I found a new equilibrium in our relationship. She accepted that this was now part of who I was, even if she didn't fully understand it. In the 17 years since my encounter, I've documented 32 reports of flying or floating Sasquatch from across North America. I've published 2 self-funded papers in fringe journals and created a database of sightings that I share with trusted researchers. Most of the scientific community still doesn't know my name. Those who do generally dismiss my work as the product of a formerly promising researcher who lost his way. The mainstream Bigfoot community largely rejects my findings as too extraordinary, too far outside the biological framework they're trying to establish for Sasquatch. But there are others, witnesses, researchers, open-minded scientists, who recognize the importance of documenting these experiences, regardless of whether they fit our current understanding of what's possible. I don't know what I saw that night on Highway 12. I don't know if it was a Sasquatch as traditionally defined, or something else that resembles what we call Sasquatch. I don't know how it defied gravity or what it wanted with that dog. What I do know is that it was real. I saw it. It saw me. And in that moment of mutual recognition, the boundaries of my reality expanded to include possibilities I had never considered before. That's been a heck of a ride in the research field. Challenging, isolating at times, but ultimately the most honest work I've ever done. Because once you know something impossible is actually possible, you can't go back to not knowing. You can only go forward, carrying that knowledge, looking for others who share it, and hoping that someday the world will catch up to what you've already seen with your own eyes. Story 9. My name is Melissa Thompson. What I'm about to tell you happened to my family and me between 1998 and 2000, just outside Newcomerstown, Ohio. I've waited years to put this down on paper, partly because I needed distance from it, and partly because I didn't think anyone would believe me. I'm not even sure I believe it myself sometimes, but I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And I know what followed us. It started on a Friday evening in October 1998. Mom had left for her night shift at the packaging plant in Dover, about 30 minutes away. My sister Jenny and I were alone in our house, which sat on 5 acres at the end of a gravel road called Applewood Lane. Our property backed up against a dense stretch of woods that ran for miles. The nearest neighbor was almost half a mile down the road. Jenny was 16 then, 2 years older than me. She was sprawled on the couch watching some teen drama on TV while I sat at the kitchen table finishing homework. It was around 8:30 p.m. when we heard the first knock. 3 hard, deliberate bangs on our back door, not knuckles on wood. This was heavier, like someone using the bottom of their fist. "Jenny!" I called out. "Did you hear that?" She muted the TV. "Yeah, must be Hank from down the road." Hank Caldwell sometimes dropped by with fresh vegetables from his garden or to check if Mom needed anything fixed. But he always came to the front door, and never this late. "I'll check," I said, getting up from the table. I flipped on the back porch light and looked through the window beside the door. Nothing was there. I returned to the kitchen. "No one's there." Jenny shrugged and turned the volume back up. I had just sat back down when we heard it again. 3 more loud bangs, but this time at the side door off the mudroom. Jenny shot up from the couch. "What the hell?" My heart started pounding. "Someone's messing with us." "It's probably just Ryan and his stupid friends," Jenny said, referring to her ex-boyfriend, who'd been trying to get her attention since their breakup 2 weeks earlier. We stood in the hallway, frozen, listening. The house had gone completely silent, except for the low murmur of the TV. Then it came again. 3 thunderous blows against our front door that made the hinges rattle. Jenny grabbed my arm. Her fingers dug into my skin. "Call Mom," she whispered. I ran to the kitchen and snatched the cordless phone, punching in Mom's work number with shaking fingers. She answered on the 4th ring. "Mom," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Someone's banging on all our doors. First the back, then the side, now the front." "Did you see who it is?" She sounded instantly alert. "No, we're scared." "I'm coming home right now," she said. "Lock all the doors and stay away from the windows. I'll be there in 20 minutes. We hung up and I relayed the message to Jenny. "Should we call the sheriff?" she asked. "Let's wait for Mom," I said, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe because calling the police seemed like an overreaction. Maybe because I was embarrassed at how scared I felt. We huddled on the couch in the living room, away from the windows, with all the lights turned on and the TV volume low. Every creak of the house made us jump. 10 minutes passed without another knock. "Maybe they left," Jenny whispered. Then we heard scratching at the front door, not knocking this time, but a slow, deliberate scraping sound, like nails or claws being dragged across the wood. Jenny grabbed the fireplace poker. I picked up the heavy flashlight we kept by the couch for power outages. We stood facing the door, neither of us breathing. The scratching stopped. Then came a new sound, a low, rumbling growl from the front porch. Not a dog's growl. This was deeper, more guttural, vibrating through the floorboards. Headlights swept across the living room as Mom's car pulled into the driveway. The engine cut off, and her car door slammed. "Girls!" she called out. "Mom!" we both shouted, rushing to unlock the front door. Mom hurried inside, her work uniform still on, her face tight with worry. "Are you okay? What happened?" We told her everything while she checked all the doors and windows. Nothing was damaged, but when she shined her flashlight through the front window, she spotted muddy prints on the porch. Large, oddly shaped prints that didn't look like regular boots or shoes. "I'm calling Dwight," she said, referring to her friend who worked as a deputy for the county sheriff. She made the call, and he promised to drive by on his patrol. While we waited, we heard plaintive meowing from outside. Our 2 cats, Jasper and Molly, were normally in the house at night, but they must have slipped out earlier. "The cats are still out there," I said. "Whatever it was might have scared them." Mom went to the door. "I'm going to look for them. You two stay inside." Jenny and I watched from the window as Mom walked around the yard with her flashlight. After a few minutes, she called back to us. "They're up in the maple tree. Bring me the cat carrier." I grabbed the carrier from the utility room and joined Mom in the yard. The night air felt cold against my skin, and I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the edge of the woods, about 50 yards from our house. Jenny followed me out. Together, we stared up at the tall maple tree where Jasper and Molly were perched on a high branch, their eyes glowing in the flashlight beam. They were never tree climbers. Both were lazy house cats who barely mustered the energy to hop onto the couch. "They must have been terrified to climb that high," Mum said, frowning. "It took us nearly an hour to coax them down. Even after we brought them inside, they remained agitated, hiding under furniture and hissing at nothing." Dwight arrived around 11 p.m., walked the perimeter of our property, and found nothing except those strange prints on the porch, which he said were probably from a bear. "Bears don't knock on doors in sequence," I argued. He shrugged. "They can be curious. Maybe it smelled food. I'll file a report, but honestly, Diane," he said to Mom, "it was probably just some kids playing a prank." We tried to believe him, but none of us slept well that night. For the next few weeks, nothing unusual happened. The incident faded into background noise, explained away as either neighborhood kids or a hungry bear. Life returned to normal: school, homework, Mom's shifts at the plant. Then, just before Thanksgiving, I had my second encounter. It was a Wednesday evening, around 7:30 p.m. Mom was cooking dinner, and Jenny was at a friend's house working on a school project. I took our dog, a German Shepherd mix named Rex, out for his evening bathroom break. Rex was a confident dog, protective and alert, but rarely jumpy. He'd been with us since he was a puppy, and at 5 years old, he was in his prime, strong, healthy, and fearless. I stood on the back porch while Rex trotted into the yard. The night was clear and cold, with a quarter moon providing just enough light to see the outline of the woods behind our property. Rex sniffed around, marking his usual spots. I wasn't paying much attention until I noticed he had stopped moving. He stood rigid at the edge of the yard, facing the tree line. Every muscle in his body tensed, and the fur along his spine rose in a ridge. "Rex?" I called softly. "What is it, boy?" He didn't respond. He seemed frozen in place. Then I saw it. At first, it was just a deeper patch of darkness against the tree line. But as my eyes adjusted, I could make out a massive shape standing just at the edge of the woods. It was tall, much taller than any person I'd ever seen. I later estimated it was at least 8 feet in height. The width of it was what really struck me. The shoulders were extraordinarily broad, tapering down to a narrower waist, and it was watching us. I couldn't see eyes exactly, but I felt its attention fixed on me like a physical weight. Rex let out a low, trembling whine, a sound I'd never heard him make before. His legs were shaking so badly that he actually lost his balance and fell off the edge of the porch, tumbling onto the grass below. But he didn't run. He stayed low to the ground, whimpering. I couldn't move either. I stood paralyzed, my hand gripping the porch railing. A rational part of my brain was screaming at me to run inside, to call for Mum, to do something, but my body refused to obey. The figure at the tree line shifted slightly. In the dim moonlight, I could see now that it was covered in hair, thick, shaggy hair that moved with the breeze. Not clothes, not a costume. Actual hair, covering its entire body. It took one step forward out of the tree line. That broke my paralysis. I lunged for Rex, grabbing his collar and dragged him backward toward the house. He came willingly, scrambling on his belly rather than standing up. "Mom!" I screamed as I yanked open the back door. "Mom!" She rushed from the kitchen, wooden spoon still in hand. "What? What happened?" "There's something out there," I gasped. "In the yard. By the woods." Rex huddled behind my legs, still whimpering. Mom looked from me to the dog, then grabbed the flashlight from the counter and moved toward the door. "Mom, don't!" But she was already stepping onto the porch, shining the beam toward the tree line. I stood in the doorway, my heart hammering against my ribs. "I don't see anything, Melissa," she said after a moment. I peered past her. The tree line was empty. Whatever had been there was gone. "It was there," I insisted. "I swear. It was huge, Mom, like impossibly big and covered in hair." She lowered the flashlight and turned to face me. "What exactly did you see?" I described it as best I could, the height, the width, the hair covering its body. Mum's expression changed. She didn't look skeptical anymore. She looked worried. "Let's get inside," she said quietly. Once we were back in the kitchen, with the door locked behind us, she sat me down at the table. Rex stayed pressed against my legs, still trembling slightly. "Melissa," Mum said carefully, "what you're describing sounds like the Bigfoot stories from around here." "Bigfoot? Come on, Mom." Despite what I'd just seen, the words sounded ridiculous. "We're only about 25 minutes from Salt Fork State Park," she continued. "There have been sightings there for years. I never put much stock in them, but—" She trailed off, looking at Rex. Our brave, protective dog was still cowering like a frightened puppy. "Whatever it was," I said, "it scared Rex so badly he fell off the porch. I've never seen him act like that." Mom nodded slowly. "I believe you saw something. Let's just be extra careful for a while, okay? No going outside alone after dark." We didn't tell Jenny what happened. She was going through a rough patch at school, and Mom didn't want to give her one more thing to worry about. We also didn't report it to anyone. What would we say? That I saw a Bigfoot watching our house? We'd be laughingstocks. For the next several months, life continued normally on the surface. Underneath, though, things had changed. I found myself constantly scanning the tree line during daylight hours. At night, I kept my bedroom curtains tightly closed. Rex refused to go into the yard alone after dark, and even during the day, he stayed close to the house. The third incident happened in April 2000, about a year and a half after the first encounter. I was asleep in my bedroom, which faced the backyard and the woods beyond. My cat Jasper was curled up at the foot of my bed as usual. The window was cracked open about 2 inches. It was a mild spring night, and I liked the fresh air. I woke sometime after midnight to the sensation of something scratching at my arm. It was Jasper, his claws digging in with unusual intensity. Before I could push him away, I realized he wasn't trying to wake me for attention. He was trying to burrow under my blankets. His entire body vibrated with fear, his eyes wide and fixed on my bedroom window. That's when I heard it. A scream ripped through the night air, so close it seemed to be right outside my window. It wasn't human. It wasn't any animal I recognized. It started low and rose in pitch until it became an ear-splitting shriek that made my teeth ache and my skin prickle. The sound lasted for maybe 10 seconds, though it felt like an eternity. When it finally stopped, the silence that followed was almost as terrifying. Jasper had managed to force his way under my comforter and was pressed against my side, still trembling. I couldn't move. I couldn't even call out for Mum. Then came a new sound. heavy footsteps moving through our yard, directly past my window. The footfalls were spaced far apart, like something with an enormous stride was walking deliberately alongside our house. I heard Mom's bedroom door open down the hall. "Melissa!" she called out. "Mom!" I finally managed to whisper. Then louder, "Mom!" She appeared in my doorway, her face pale in the darkness. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, clutching my blankets to my chin. "It's outside. It's walking around the house." We heard another noise then, a deep rumbling sound from the side of the house where our living room was located. It wasn't quite a growl, not quite a hum. It was almost like someone trying to imitate speech without knowing the words. Mom moved to my bed and sat on the edge, putting her arm around me. "It's okay," she said, though her voice shook. "We're safe inside." We didn't sleep for the rest of the night. We sat together on my bed, listening as the footsteps circled our house once, twice, 3 times. Occasionally there would be another of those rumbling vocalizations or a light scratching at the siding of the house. By dawn, the sounds had stopped. When we finally ventured into the living room as the sun rose, we found Jenny already awake, sitting rigid on the couch. "Did you guys hear that last night?" she asked. We nodded. What the hell was it? Mom and I exchanged glances. Then I told her everything, both previous encounters, what Mom had said about Bigfoot sightings near Salt Fork, all of it. Instead of laughing or dismissing it, Jenny went pale. "I think I saw it too, a couple months ago, coming home from Lacey's house. I thought it was just a shadow or something, but it was big, really big. That morning we checked around the house and found several things that chilled us to the bone. Deep indentations in the soft earth beneath my window, wide swaths of mud wiped clean from the siding about 8 feet up, as if something tall had brushed against the house. And most disturbing of all, claw marks etched into the wooden frame of my window. 2 weeks later, Mom announced we were moving. She'd found a house closer to town, on a busy street with neighbors on both sides. She claimed it was to be closer to her new job, but we all knew the real reason. As we packed up our belongings, I kept thinking about what had brought that creature to our house in the first place. Why us? Was it just territorial, upset that we were living near its habitat? Or was there something more deliberate about its actions? The knocking on our doors in sequence, the repeated visits over 18 months, the vocalizations that sounded almost like attempts at communication. I never found answers to those questions. We moved in May 2000, and I've never experienced anything like it since. Mom still lives in that house in town. Jenny moved to Columbus after college. I ended up in Cincinnati with my husband and kids. Sometimes, when I visit Mom, I drive past our old house on Applewood Lane. New people live there now, a young couple with a baby. I've thought about stopping, about warning them, but what would I say? That an 8-foot-tall hairy creature might come knocking on their doors some night. They probably wouldn't believe me. I'm not sure I would believe it myself if I hadn't experienced it, but I did experience it. I saw it with my own eyes, standing at the edge of our yard. I heard its blood-curdling scream outside my window. I felt the fear it instilled in our animals, and in us. Whatever it was, Bigfoot, forest spirit, or something science hasn't classified yet, it was real, and for those 18 months outside Newcomers Town, Ohio, it was fixated on my family. I just hope it stayed in those woods when we left, and that the new family never has to hear that terrible scream in the middle of the night. Story 10. I never believed the old stories until I saw it with my own eyes. That first time changed everything. My name's Marcus Yellowfeather, and I've worked security for the Muckleshoot tribe going on 15 years now. Before that, I made my living as a commercial fisherman, but neither job prepared me for what I've seen in these woods. The first time was back in '96. I was 17, cocky as hell, and thought I knew everything. Me and my buddies, Rick Swallow, Jimmy Two Stars, and Donnie Blackwater, had snagged a case of Rainier beer from Donnie's older brother. We needed somewhere quiet to drink it, where the tribal police wouldn't bust us. "Let's go to that new building site," Jimmy suggested, pointing toward the far edge of the reservation where construction had started on a community center. Nobody's there at night. It seemed perfect. The skeleton of the building had an awning already up, giving us shelter from the typical Auburn drizzle. The four of us huddled under it, popping open beers and bullshitting about girls from school. "Man, Stacy Little Creek was looking at you today," Rick jabbed me in the ribs. "You should ask her out." I took a long swig. "Maybe I will." The night was going fine until about 10:30. That's when the dogs started. First one, then another, until it seemed like every dog for a mile was barking their heads off. "What's got them so worked up?" Donnie asked, crushing his third can. I stood up, walked to the edge of the awning, and peered into the darkness. The reservation streetlights were sparse out this way, casting more shadows than light. "Probably just a coyote," Jimmy said. Then I saw it, movement behind a thick Douglas fir about 30 yards away. At first I thought it was a shadow shifting, but then it moved again. Something massive and black was peeking around the trunk. "Guys," I said, my voice catching, "there's something out there." "Quit being a pussy," Rick laughed, but he stood up too. The thing moved again, and this time I saw more of it. It was huge, impossibly big. The tree it stood beside was mature, at least 16 inches in diameter, and this thing dwarfed it. Standing upright on two legs, its head had to be 10, maybe 12 feet off the ground. "Holy shit," I whispered. The dogs were going absolutely insane now, a wall of panic barking. "What is it?" Donnie asked, coming to stand beside me. "I don't know, but it's fucking enormous." The thing shifted its position, and I caught a glimpse of a massive shoulder covered in black hair or fur. It moved with an eerie smoothness, like it was trying to be quiet despite its size. "We need to go," I said, backing up slowly. "Now." "Man, we just got here," Jimmy complained. "I'm not even buzzed yet." "There's something out there," I insisted. "Something big." "Probably just Earl Walking Bull checking on the construction site," Rick suggested, but his voice wavered. "Earl isn't 12 feet tall and covered in fur," I snapped. Whatever was watching us moved again, and this time we all saw it, a massive black silhouette slipping from one tree to another. The movement was too fluid for anything that large, too quiet. "Fuck this." Donnie grabbed his remaining beers. "I'm out." We left the rest of the case and booked it back toward the populated area of the reservation, not stopping until we reached the bright lights of the gas station. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. "What the hell was that?" Jimmy panted. "Sasquatch," I said, the word feeling strange in my mouth. "Had to be," Rick laughed nervously. "Man, that's just stories the elders tell to keep kids from wandering off." "You saw it," I insisted. We didn't talk about it much after that night. Teenage boys don't like admitting when they're scared, but I knew what I'd seen, and it stuck with me. Years passed. I graduated high school, tried college for a semester before dropping out, then took up commercial fishing. The work was hard, but paid well. I'd almost forgotten about that night under the awning until 2003, when it happened again. My cousin Travis and I were driving back to the reservation after a fishing trip up north. It was late, maybe 11:30 p.m., and we were passing by a new housing project on tribal land. "Slow down," Travis suddenly said, pointing out his window. "What's that?" I eased off the gas and squinted into the darkness. At first, I didn't see anything, but then a shape moved along the tree line. "Pull over," Travis urged. I stopped the truck and cut the engine, leaving the headlights on. The figure was about 50 yards away, standing at the edge of the cleared construction site. "Looks like someone checking out the construction," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew that wasn't right. "Flip the brights on," Travis suggested. I hit the high beams, and that's when it turned and looked directly at us. The light caught its eyes, reflecting back like a deer's, but much higher off the ground. "Jesus Christ," Travis whispered. It wasn't human. The proportions were all wrong. A wide, stocky torso with long arms that hung down past its knees, and it was covered, head to toe, in dark hair or fur. Its face was obscured by the same coating, but I could make out the reflection of eyes and the outline of a broad, flat nose. "It's one of them," I said, my mouth dry, like I saw when I was a kid. The creature stared at us for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Then, with surprising grace, it turned and loped into the woods. "Follow it," Travis urged. "Are you crazy? No way." "Come on, Mark, this is our chance to see one up close." Against my better judgment, I started the truck and slowly drove toward where the creature had disappeared. When we reached the spot, Travis jumped out with a flashlight. "Look at this," he called. The ground where the being had stood was about 3 or 4 feet below road level, at the bottom of a drainage ditch. I hadn't realized that from our vantage point in the truck. "It was standing down here," Travis said, his voice tinged with awe. "Which means—" "It was even bigger than it looked," I finished. 9-10 feet at least. I remembered the hair on its arms, longer at the ends, almost like a fringe, nothing I'd ever seen on any animal before. We searched for footprints, but found nothing conclusive in the disturbed soil of the construction site. That second sighting shook me, but not like the third one. The third one changed me. It was October 2008. My brother Charlie, my 3-year-old nephew Tyler, and I decided to go hunting in the foothills east of Auburn. Charlie was a big hunter, went out every season, but I mostly joined for the company. That morning we parked my truck at our usual spot, a logging road that had been decommissioned years earlier. "Tyler's getting fussy," Charlie said as we geared up. "Maybe he should stay in the truck while we scout ahead." I nodded. "I'll stay with him." "Nah, come on. We'll just go a quarter mile in, check the game trail, and be back in 30 minutes. He'll be fine." I was hesitant. "You sure?" "The doors will be locked, windows up. He's got his blanket and toys. He'll probably fall asleep anyway." We made sure Tyler was comfortable in his car seat, locked the truck, and headed into the woods. The plan was simple. Check the trail, look for deer sign, and return quickly. About 20 minutes in, we came to a small clearing. Charlie stopped, pointing to some fresh droppings. "Deer was here this morning," he whispered. "Let's split up. You go right around that ridge. I'll circle left. Meet back here in 15. I nodded, checked my rifle, and headed right. The ground sloped down into a small depression, then up again to a rocky outcropping. I moved carefully, scanning the ground for tracks. That's when I saw it, what looked like a burned stump in another small clearing below me. Weird place for a fire, I thought. I raised my rifle to use the scope for a better look. What I saw through that scope haunts me to this day. It wasn't a stump. It was a head and shoulders, massive and covered in black hair. As I watched, frozen, it turned slightly, and I saw its face. The features were almost human, but distorted. A heavy brow ridge, wide, flattened nose, and a mouth that seemed too wide for its face. But it was the eyes that got me. They were jet black, no whites visible at all, like bottomless pits in its face. Those eyes were looking in the direction of my truck, where Tyler was. My finger tensed on the trigger, not out of any desire to shoot, but from pure animal fear. The slight movement must have caught its attention. The creature's head swiveled, and suddenly those black eyes were staring directly at me through my scope. I jerked back from the rifle, almost dropping it. The creature rose to its full height, at least 9 feet tall, with shoulders twice as wide as any man's. For a moment, we just stared at each other across the distance. Then it opened its mouth and screamed. The sound started as a high-pitched shriek, like a woman being murdered, then dropped to a deep, gravelly roar that seemed to vibrate the air itself. It echoed off the hills, bouncing back and multiplying until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. I heard Charlie yelling my name from somewhere to my left. In the distance, car doors slammed as other hunters fled the sound. The creature screamed again, then dropped to all fours and moved with shocking speed into the deeper forest. I stood paralyzed for several seconds before Charlie crashed through the underbrush beside me. "What the fuck was that?" he demanded, his face pale. "We need to get back to Tyler," was all I could say. We ran back to the truck, finding Tyler awake and crying. Charlie scooped him up, checking him over. "He's fine," Charlie said, "just scared by the noise." I couldn't speak. My hands were shaking so badly I had to give Charlie the keys. As we drove home, I kept seeing those black eyes in my mind, feeling them looking through me. I didn't go into the woods for almost a year after that. Couldn't bring myself to. I made excuses. Too busy with work, needed to save money, whatever I could think of. My dreams were filled with those eyes and that scream. Charlie noticed, of course. One night, about 11 months later, he showed up at my place with a six-pack. "Time to talk about it," he said, handing me a beer. "About what?" "About what you saw that day in the woods." I took a long drink. "You'll think I'm crazy." "Try me." So I told him everything. The size of the creature, the black eyes, the scream that started human and ended animal. I told him about my earlier sightings, too. Charlie didn't laugh or dismiss me, he just listened. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "Grandfather would say you've been chosen." "Chosen for what?" "To see. Not everyone does." "Lucky me," I said bitterly. Charlie shrugged. "The old stories say they've always been here. They choose who sees them and when." "Why me? 3 times." "Maybe you're meant to remember what others have forgotten." I don't know if Charlie was right. I don't know why I've seen what I've seen, but I know what I saw was real as the trees and rocks and sky. Something exists in these woods that most people never encounter, something that walks the boundary between our world and something older. I still work security for the tribe, still live on the reservation. But I go into the woods differently now, aware, respectful, eyes open, because I know they're watching. Those black eyes are always watching, and sometimes on quiet nights when the dogs start barking for no reason, I remember how it felt to be 17, watching a shadow move behind a tree, and I wonder if it remembers me too. Story 11. I checked my watch again, 5:30 p.m. The others should have been here by now. I tossed another log onto the small pile I'd gathered and scanned the path leading to our spot by the Kalamazoo River. Nothing but trees and shadows growing longer as the sun sank lower. This was our regular weekend ritual since high school, me, Chuck, Dale and Mike meeting up at what we'd dubbed the tree, a massive split oak that had somehow survived a lightning strike years ago. The tree stood like a sentinel at the edge of a small clearing about a quarter mile from the railroad tracks. Perfect spot to drink beer, shoot the shit, and forget about the factory jobs waiting for us on Monday morning. I'd brought a case of Budweiser, some jerky, and my Walkman. Typical Friday night supplies for June 1985 in rural Michigan. At 22, I wasn't exactly living the high life, but these weekend gatherings kept me sane. "Where the hell are you guys?" I muttered, kicking at the dirt with my boot. The clearing looked pretty much the same as always, the old fire ring of stones, blackened from countless nights of flames. The fallen log we used as a bench. The game trail leading deeper into the woods. Everything normal, except for the total absence of my friends. I decided to keep busy rather than just wait around like an idiot. For the next hour, I gathered more firewood than we could possibly use in one night, stacking it neatly beside the fire ring. The physical activity felt good, kept my mind occupied. The heat of the day had begun to ease off. I wiped sweat from my forehead with my t-shirt sleeve and sat down on the log. The sky had taken on that golden quality it gets just before sunset, sunlight filtering through the trees in long beams. Normally, I'd have been sharing this moment with 3 other guys, all of us cracking jokes and opening our second or third beers. My watch now read 7:15. No way they were coming at this point. Something must have come up. Maybe Dale's piece of shit Chevy had broken down again. Or Chuck had talked them into going to that new bar in town instead. I stood up, stretched, and felt a familiar pressure in my bladder from the 2 beers I'd already drunk. Might as well take care of that before heading back. I walked over to the split oak tree and positioned myself behind its massive trunk, unzipping my jeans. The sound of my urine hitting the ground and the relief that came with it almost made me miss the feeling at first. But then it hit me hard. That unmistakable sensation of being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood straight up. A chill ran down my spine despite the warm evening air. I finished quickly, zipped up and turned around. That's when I saw it. Standing about 20 to 30 feet away on the game trail was something. My brain scrambled to categorize what my eyes were seeing, but nothing fit. It was tall, taller than any man I'd ever seen, and covered in dark, matted hair. But what struck me most was its width. The thing was impossibly broad, with shoulders that seemed to span twice what a normal person's would. Its head didn't sit right either. It seemed to rest directly on those massive shoulders, with no visible neck. In the fading light, I couldn't make out facial features, just a darker shadow where a face should be. I blinked hard, certain I was seeing things, but when my eyes opened, it remained there, absolutely still. "Hello?" I called out, my voice embarrassingly weak and shaky. No response, no movement, just that thing standing there watching me. My first coherent thought was that someone was playing a joke. Maybe the guys had set this up, were hiding nearby with a camera, waiting to laugh at me freaking out over some elaborate costume. "Very funny, assholes," I shouted, my voice stronger now, fueled by the possibility of being the butt of a prank. Still nothing. I took a step forward, then another, then a third. As I moved toward it, the creature backed up the exact same distance, maintaining the gap between us. Its movement was fluid but strange, almost like it glided backward rather than stepped. I stopped. It stopped. I took 2 steps back. It moved forward 2 steps. My heart pounded in my chest like a jackhammer. This wasn't a prank. This was something else entirely. We stood there engaged in this bizarre standoff. I couldn't look away from it. It didn't seem to blink or breathe or shift its weight like a person would. Just that unwavering, silent attention focused directly on me. Then it moved. 1 step forward. Its foot, if you could call it that, came down on a fallen branch. The snap of breaking wood echoed through the clearing like a gunshot. That sound broke whatever spell had fallen over me. My body unfroze, and a single thought filled my mind. Run. I turned and sprinted toward the railroad tracks. I didn't follow the path, but crashed straight through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face and arms. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. My lungs burned and my legs pumped like pistons as I scrambled up the steep hill leading to the tracks. When I finally reached the top, I doubled over, hands on my knees, gasping for breath. Only then did I realize how dark it had gotten. The sun had been just above the tree line when I first spotted the creature, but now it was nearly full dark. I glanced at my watch. 8:45 p.m. That couldn't be right. It felt like I'd stared at that thing for maybe a minute or two, not over an hour. I tapped the watch face, certain it had stopped working properly. I finally gathered enough courage to look back down the hill toward the clearing. I couldn't see much in the gathering darkness, just the vague outlines of trees and brush. No sign of movement. No sign of whatever that thing had been. The walk back to my truck took 20 minutes. Every sound made me jump. A squirrel scurrying through leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of wind through the trees. I kept looking over my shoulder, certain I would see that massive, hairy shape following me. The relief I felt upon seeing my blue Chevy S10 sitting alone in the small dirt pull-off was overwhelming. I fumbled with my keys, dropped them, cursed, and snatched them up again. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. Once inside the truck, I locked the doors and sat there, gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady my breathing. The case of beer sat on the passenger seat where I'd left it, minus the 2 I'd drunk earlier. I grabbed another, popped it open, and drank half of it in one long gulp. I turned the key in the ignition, and the engine roared to life. The dashboard clock read 9:12 p.m. I switched on the headlights, illuminating the narrow dirt road ahead and the dense trees on either side. As I put the truck in gear, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Nothing there, just darkness. The drive home to my apartment in Plainwell took about 25 minutes. I drove too fast on the back roads, taking curves recklessly, desperate to get away from those woods. Once on the main highway, other cars provided some comfort. Normal people going about their normal Friday night activities, completely unaware of what lurked in the forests near the Kalamazoo River. I didn't call my friends that night. What would I say? Hey, I saw Bigfoot while taking a piss behind our tree. They'd never let me live it down. Instead, I drank the rest of my six-pack, locked every window and door in my apartment, and sat on the couch with the TV blaring until I finally passed out around 3 a.m. Saturday morning brought sunshine and the temptation to dismiss the whole thing as some kind of hallucination. Maybe someone had slipped something into my beer before I left. Maybe I'd fallen asleep waiting for the guys and dreamed the whole encounter. The phone rang around noon. It was Chuck. "Jake, man, sorry about last night," he said. "Dale's mom went to the hospital, gallbladder attack or something. We all ended up going there instead." "It's fine," I said, my mouth dry. "Everything okay with his mom?" "Yeah, she's good. Surgery scheduled for Monday. We still on for tonight?" My stomach tightened at the thought of going back to that clearing, that tree. "I don't know, man. I'm not feeling great." "Come on, don't be a pussy. We missed last night, can't miss two in a row. Tradition, man." I hesitated. "Yeah, okay, but let's meet somewhere else. That spot by Miller's Pond, maybe?" "What's wrong with the tree? We always go to the tree." I couldn't tell him. "Just want to change, that's all." Chuck laughed. "Whatever, Reynolds. The tree it is. Mike's bringing his new girlfriend. 7 o'clock. Don't be late." He hung up before I could argue further. I spent the rest of the day trying to distract myself, cleaned my apartment, did laundry, changed the oil in my truck. Normal Saturday stuff. But my mind kept circling back to those woods, to that creature standing there, watching me with what felt like ancient, patient eyes. By 6:30 I'd made my decision. I wouldn't go. I'd make up some excuse tomorrow. Food poisoning, sudden flu, whatever. I'd never go back to that clearing again. The phone rang. Mike this time. "Dude, where are you? We're all here waiting." I glanced at the clock, 7:10 p.m. already. "Sorry, not feeling well. Stomach bug or something." "Bullshit. Chuck says you were acting weird earlier too. Get your ass down here. Sarah brought her friend Jessica, smoking hot blonde who works at the mall. She's definitely checking out your picture on my keychain." The lie formed in my mouth, ready to be delivered. But something else came out instead. "Did anything weird ever happen to you guys at the tree when I wasn't there?" Silence for a moment. Then Mike's voice, slightly lower. "What kind of weird?" My heart rate picked up. "I don't know, just seeing things that shouldn't be there." Another pause. "Jake, you need to get down here now." "Why?" "Just come. And don't take the path from the railroad tracks. Park at the old fishing spot and come in from the riverside." The line went dead. 20 minutes later I was parking my truck at the small clearing where locals sometimes launch canoes into the river. My palms were sweaty on the steering wheel. Every instinct told me to turn around and drive away. Instead, I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out into the humid evening air. The sun hadn't quite set yet, but the dense trees made the forest floor dark already. I clicked on the flashlight and headed toward the path that followed the riverbank. This route to our spot was longer and less direct, requiring about a 15-minute walk along the water before cutting inland toward the clearing. I moved quickly, jumping at every sound, the beam of my flashlight jerking from tree to tree. As I approached the clearing, I heard voices and saw the orange glow of a fire. Relief washed over me. My friends were there, just as Mike had said. Normal people, safety in numbers. I stepped into the clearing. Chuck and Dale sat on the log, beers in hand. Mike stood near the fire with his arm around a pretty brunette who must have been Sarah. Another girl, presumably Jessica, sat on a camping chair, her blonde hair catching the firelight. "There he is," Mike called out. "The man of the hour." They all turned to look at me. Their expressions were off, too intense, too focused, like they'd been waiting for me specifically, not just waiting for their friend to arrive. "Hey," I said, walking closer. "Sorry I'm late." Chuck stood up and handed me a beer. "We need to talk, Jake." "About what?" "About what you saw last night." I froze, beer halfway to my lips. "What do you mean?" Dale spoke up. "You saw it, didn't you? By the tree. The thing." My stomach dropped. "How do you know about that?" The five of them exchanged glances. Sarah tightened her grip on Mike's arm. "Because we've all seen it," Mike said quietly. "At different times. Always here. Always alone." "What the hell is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Chuck sat back down, took a long pull from his beer. "We don't know. First time I saw it was 3 years ago. Came early to set up before any of you guys got here. It was standing right where you're standing now. I immediately stepped to the side, away from that spot." "Dale saw it last summer," Chuck continued. "Mike last fall." "It watched me for over an hour," Dale said. "Didn't move, didn't make a sound. Just observed." "But we never talk about it," Mike added. "It feels wrong somehow, like talking about it gives it power or something." "Then why are we talking about it now?" I demanded. "Because of how it's escalating," Chuck said. "Sarah saw it 2 weeks ago, walking home from work, in town, not out here in the woods." Sarah nodded, her face pale. "It was standing under a streetlight, just staring at me. I ran all the way home." "And Jessica?" Mike gestured to the blonde, who hadn't spoken yet. "I've never seen it," she said, her voice steady. "But I've been researching similar sightings in the area. There are dozens going back at least 50 years. Always the same description, tall, wide, no neck, covered in dark hair, always watching, never threatening." "What is it?" I asked again. Jessica shook her head. "No one knows. Some people think it's a Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Others say it's something else entirely. Not an animal, not a human, but something in between worlds. That's why we keep coming back here," Dale explained. "To understand it, to figure out what it wants." "And have you?" I asked. "Figured it out." The five of them exchanged glances again. "We think it's choosing people," Chuck said slowly. "For what, we don't know. But there's a pattern. It appears to someone, watches them, then moves on to someone connected to that person. Like it's working its way through a social network," Jessica added, "learning about us, one person at a time." I looked around the clearing, at the darkening woods beyond. "Is it here now, watching us?" "No," Mike said. "It never shows up when we're in a group, only when someone's alone." "So what do we do?" I asked. "Just keep coming back here, waiting for it to appear again?" "For now, yes," Chuck said. "It hasn't hurt anyone that we know of. It just watches." "And we watch back," Dale added. "Learn what we can." I took a long drink of my beer, trying to process all this. Part of me wanted to get in my truck and drive away, never see these people or these woods again. But another part, a part I didn't fully understand, felt a strange pull toward the mystery of it all. "There's something else you should know," Jessica said, leaning forward. "The time distortion you experienced, that's common in these encounters. People report missing time or time seeming to stretch out." "How did you know about that?" I asked. "Mike told me what you said on the phone. It's a classic sign. We talked for hours after that, sharing details of our individual encounters, comparing notes. As the fire died down to embers and the case of beer emptied, I found myself accepting this new reality, that something unexplainable lived in these woods, and for whatever reason, it had taken an interest in our small group of friends. Around midnight, we packed up to leave. As the others headed toward the path leading to the parking area, I lingered, staring at the split oak tree. In the darkness, Its divided trunk looked almost like a doorway to somewhere else. "Jake, you coming?" Chuck called from the edge of the clearing. "Yeah," I said, turning away from the tree. "I'm coming." But I knew I would return alone someday. The creature had shown itself to me, had singled me out for its silent observation, and despite the fear, despite every rational thought telling me to stay away, I felt compelled to learn more. As we walked through the dark woods toward our vehicles, I glanced back once more at the clearing, now lost in shadows. For just a moment, I thought I saw movement, something large shifting position near the tree. Then it was gone, and I was left wondering if it had ever really been there at all. Story 12. I was just 7 years old when I first met him. That's what I call him now. Him. Though back then, I didn't have a name for what I saw. It was June 1972, the last day of second grade at Oakwood Elementary in Kalamazoo County. The air smelled like freshly cut grass and charcoal from the barbecue grills our teachers had set up for our end-of-year picnic. The playground buzzed with kids playing tag and screaming with that special kind of freedom that only comes on the last day of school. I remember Mrs. Harmon, my teacher, calling out to make sure nobody wandered too far, but I was already drifting toward the edge of the woods that backed up to our school property. I had spotted clusters of pine cones scattered on the ground, and I wanted to collect the perfect ones for a craft project my mom had shown me in a magazine. "Catherine, don't go too far," Mrs. Harmon called, but her voice was already growing faint as I stepped into the cool shade of the pines. The ground felt soft under my feet, cushioned with years of fallen needles. I bent down, selecting the biggest pine cones and stuffing them into the pockets of my blue cotton dress. My hands were sticky with sap, and I remember wiping them on my dress, not caring about the stains I'd have to explain later. I moved deeper into the woods, focused entirely on my treasure hunt. The sounds of the playground faded completely, replaced by the whisper of wind through the pine branches and occasional bird calls overhead. That's when it happened. I rounded a large tree trunk, head down, eyes scanning the ground for more pine cones, and walked straight into something solid. My first thought was that I'd hit another tree, but when I looked up, I realized I was staring at a pair of legs, massive legs covered in thick chocolate-brown hair. My eyes traveled upward, taking in the enormous figure standing motionless before me. It towered over my small frame, at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. Its body was covered in that same deep brown hair, except for its face and palms, which showed tawny reddish skin. In its right hand it clutched a large pine branch, thick as my arm. I didn't scream, I didn't run. I just stood there, my pockets bulging with pine cones, and stared. The creature's face shifted as we looked at each other. At first I saw what looked like surprise, maybe even anger at being discovered. Its brow furrowed and its mouth opened slightly, revealing teeth that seemed yellowed but not threatening. Then something changed. Its expression softened as it studied me. The deep-set eyes, a rich amber color, blinked slowly. It tilted its massive head, and I caught a whiff of its scent, earthy like wet leaves and moss. We stood there for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Neither of us moved. I wasn't scared. Not really. At 7 years old, I hadn't yet learned that such creatures weren't supposed to exist. To my young mind, this was just another discovery, like finding a particularly interesting pine cone or a new type of bird. Finally, the creature made the first move. It turned, still gripping the branch, and walked away with powerful strides. The branch swung overhead as it moved, cracking against other trees with loud snaps that echoed through the woods. I watched until it disappeared among the shadows of the pines. When I returned to the playground, pine cones spilling from my pockets, I tried to tell Mrs. Harmon about the big hairy man in the woods. She patted my head and told me I had a wonderful imagination. No one believed me. Not then, anyway. 10 years passed. I grew up, as children do, But I never forgot my encounter in the woods. Sometimes I'd dream about those amber eyes, watching me with what I now recognized as curiosity rather than malice. By 16, I'd learned enough to know what I'd seen. A Sasquatch, Bigfoot, a creature of legend that most people dismissed as fantasy. I kept the memory to myself, tucked away where others couldn't mock it. It was November 1982, a Friday night, and the first real snow of the season had fallen earlier that day. I sat on our front porch waiting for my friend Becky to pick me up for a movie. Our house stood at the end of a long gravel driveway, backed by the same woods that stretched behind my elementary school. My parents were inside watching Dallas, the sound of the TV drifting faintly through the closed front door. The porch light cast a yellow glow over the fresh snow, creating long shadows that stretched toward the tree line. I checked my watch. Becky was late as usual. The temperature had dropped since sunset, and my breath formed small clouds in the air. I zipped my jacket higher and stamped my feet to keep warm. That's when I heard it, a low guttural growl coming from the side of the house. Not a dog, not a bear. Something else entirely. It was followed by heavy footsteps, the sound of something large moving through the crusty snow. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The hairs on my arm stood up beneath my jacket. I slowly rose from the porch step, my heart hammering in my chest. This wasn't the fearless curiosity of my 7-year-old self. At 16, I knew enough to be afraid. The footsteps continued, moving along the side of our ranch-style home toward the back. I made a quick decision. Standing still felt dangerous, like being a sitting duck. Instead of rushing inside, I walked down our driveway toward the main road, singing softly to myself. Hungry Like the Wolf, by Duran Duran, the first song that came to mind. I don't know why I sang. Perhaps to announce my presence, perhaps to calm my nerves. Headlights appeared around the bend in the road. Becky's blue Chevy Citation pulled up, and I nearly yanked the door off its hinges getting in. "What's wrong with you?" Becky asked, reaching over to turn down the radio. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Drive up to the house," I said. "Just for a second." Becky rolled her eyes, but complied, easing her car up our long driveway. As we approached the house, her headlights swept across the front yard. That's when we both saw it. A massive figure peeking around the corner of the house, half hidden behind the maple tree my father had planted when we moved in. Becky screamed. I didn't. I recognized those eyes immediately, the same amber gaze that had studied me a decade earlier in the pine forest. "Go!" Becky shouted, but I touched her arm. "Wait," I said. "Just wait." The figure held still for a moment, then withdrew behind the house. In the brief illumination from the headlights, I'd seen enough to be certain. It was the same creature, older perhaps, with streaks of silver in its dark brown hair, but unmistakably the same being from my childhood. "What the hell was that?" Becky's voice shook. Her knuckles had turned white on the steering wheel. "Just a bear, probably," I lied. "Let's go to the movie." Becky didn't need convincing. She backed down the driveway so fast her tires spun on the snow. The next morning, my father discovered the footprints. They started at the edge of the woods, circled our house, and disappeared back into the tree line. Each print was nearly 18 inches long, with 5 distinct toes and a depth that suggested incredible weight. My father called the sheriff, who came out and took photographs. A professor from Western Michigan University arrived later that day, making plaster casts and measuring the stride length. I listened from the kitchen as he explained to my parents that these weren't hoaxed prints. Whatever made them weighed at least 700 pounds and stood over 8 feet tall. "Could be some kind of prank," the sheriff suggested, but he didn't sound convinced. "These aren't faked," the professor insisted. "Look at the pressure ridges, the depth variation. Something extremely heavy made these tracks." I said nothing. I knew what had made them. Throughout high school and into my college years, I often felt watched when I was at home. It wasn't a threatening feeling, more like having a guardian nearby. I took up dancing as a hobby, practicing in our living room where large windows faced the woods. Sometimes in the middle of a routine, I'd catch a glimpse of movement among the trees or feel eyes on me as I spun and leapt. After college, I stayed in Kalamazoo County, taking a job at the local library and eventually buying a small house on the outskirts of town. My property bordered the same stretch of forest that had been a constant in my life. I never mentioned my experiences to neighbors or co-workers. In a small community like ours, I didn't want to be known as that crazy Bigfoot lady. But the encounters continued, becoming more frequent as the years passed. In the winter of 1995, I woke to the sound of heavy banging on the side of my house. 3 distinct knocks, followed by silence, then 3 more. This happened 3 nights in a row, always around 2 a.m. On the 4th night, I worked up the courage to approach my kitchen window after the first set of knocks. The motion-activated security light I'd installed illuminated my backyard, and there, at the edge of the light's reach, I saw a familiar silhouette. It raised an arm as if in greeting, then melted back into the darkness. The knocking never came again after that night. In the spring of 1998, I noticed strange behavior from the deer that frequented my property. They would gather at the forest edge in the early evening, grazing peacefully, when suddenly their heads would all snap up in unison, looking at the same spot in the woods. Instead of bolting, as deer typically do when sensing a predator, they would simply stop grazing and watch. After a few minutes, they'd return to eating as if nothing had happened. I began to pay attention to where they looked. One evening, focusing on that same spot with my binoculars, I caught a glimpse of brown hair and the flash of amber eyes before whatever it was moved deeper into the trees. By 2005, development had begun to encroach on the forests around Kalamazoo County. New subdivisions and shopping centers replaced the woods I'd known all my life. I worried about the creature, my creature, as I'd begun to think of it. Where would it go as its habitat shrank? That fall, I accepted a job offer in northern Minnesota, partly to advance my career, but mostly to escape the constant construction. I found a cabin-style house on 20 acres, most of it wooded and bordering state forest land. It felt like the right move for both of us. 3 months after my relocation, on a frigid January night, I heard it for the first time in my new home. A long, mournful howl that echoed through the trees, unlike any wolf or coyote I'd ever heard. It started low, then rose to a pitch that sent shivers down my spine before fading into the darkness. The locals told me it was just wolves, but I knew better. The howls continued through that winter, always staying at the edge of my property, never coming closer. By spring, they had stopped. I thought that was the end of it until I found the gift on my porch, a perfect cluster of pine cones arranged in a neat circle. In the center lay a smooth red stone that caught the light like a gem. I recognized it immediately as the type of iron-rich rock found commonly in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, but not in Minnesota. Someone had carried it here over hundreds of miles and left it for me to find. I placed the stone on my windowsill where the morning sun would catch it, a signal, perhaps, that I understood. Last week marked the 50th anniversary of our first meeting in those Kalamazoo woods. I'm 57 now, with strands of grey in my hair and reading glasses I keep losing around the house. My Minnesota property has remained undeveloped, though new cabins have sprung up on neighboring lots. I still dance, though my knees protest more than they used to. My living room has the same large windows facing the forest, and I keep the curtains open, especially at dusk. 3 days ago, while washing dishes at the kitchen sink, I glanced up and saw him standing at the edge of my yard, older, like me, with silver dominating the brown of his hair now. His shoulders stooped slightly, but he still stood taller than any man I've ever known. Those amber eyes hadn't changed a bit. We looked at each other for a long moment, separated by glass and 50 years of shared history. I raised my hand in greeting. He did the same, his massive palm reflecting the kitchen light. Then he turned and walked into the trees with those same powerful strides I remembered from childhood, disappearing into the growing darkness. I don't fear him. I never have. Not really. Over the decades, I've come to understand that our lives have been strangely intertwined, the curious child and the watchful creature growing older together in parallel. Sometimes I wonder who's been observing whom all these years. I've never reported my experiences to any Bigfoot researchers or documentary crews. This has always felt personal, a connection I didn't want to share with the world. I've never tried to capture evidence or prove anything to anyone, but I keep the red stone on my windowsill and I leave my curtains open when I dance. And sometimes when the house feels too quiet, I find myself listening for those 3 distinct knocks that would tell me I'm not alone. Story 13. My name is Larry Thomas, and what I'm about to tell you happened to me back in '92 while I was working security up in Alaska. It wasn't something I planned on sharing widely, especially after how the management reacted. But some stories need telling, even if folks don't believe them. I'd been working the night shift for about 3 months by then, patrolling the pipeline gates along Ravella Road near Ward Lake. It was a lonely job, just me and miles of dark Alaskan wilderness, but the pay was good, and I've never minded my own company. That night started like any other. I clocked in at 10 p.m., got my assignment sheet, checked my flashlight and radio, and headed out in the company truck. A light rain had fallen earlier, leaving everything damp and the air sharp with the smell of wet earth and pine. The clouds had cleared, though, and a 3/4 moon cast enough light that I could make out the silhouettes of the hemlock trees against the night sky. I spent the first few hours doing my rounds, checking gates 1 through 6, making notes in my log, the usual routine. Nothing out of the ordinary, just the occasional rustling in the underbrush from some small critter and the constant whisper of wind through the trees. It was about 2:30 in the morning when everything changed. I was approaching Gate 7, down near the south end of the property where the road curves around close to that thick stand of old hemlocks. I always left the truck running during checks, partly because of the cold, partly because you never knew when you might need to leave in a hurry. Those woods held plenty of bears and moose, neither of which you'd want to tangle with on foot. I stepped out, flashlight in one hand, clipboard in the other. The beam cut through the darkness as I swept it across the gate, checking the lock, all secure. I was about to mark it down when something made me pause, a feeling like I was being watched. I turned, sweeping my light toward the tree line, about 50 yards away. That's when I caught them. 2 whitish, glowing eyes reflecting my beam from about 7 feet up, right beside a massive hemlock. Not low and wide like a bear's. Higher. Almost man-height, but not quite right. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding thin in the vast silence. No response. The eyes didn't move or blink. My first thought was that it might be a hunter, or maybe another security guard from the next sector over, though I wasn't expecting anyone. "This is private property," I shouted, trying to sound authoritative despite the tremor I could feel in my voice. Still, nothing. Those eyes just watched me. I made a decision then that most folks would probably question. Instead of getting back in my truck and driving away, I started walking toward whatever was out there. I'd been trained to investigate suspicious activity, and while this definitely qualified as suspicious, my curiosity temporarily overrode my caution. As I got closer, my flashlight revealed more details. It wasn't a person. It was something dark, upright, with what looked like a head, arms, and upper body. The shape was vaguely human-like, but wrong somehow, too broad, too bulky. And it was doing something to the tree beside it, stripping away pieces of bark with motions that seemed deliberate, purposeful. At about 30 yards away, I stopped. The hair on the back of my neck was standing straight up. My mouth had gone dry. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't a bear, wasn't a moose, wasn't anything I recognized. I whistled, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the night. It was an instinctive thing, something between trying to scare it off and trying to confirm it was real. The creature's head swiveled toward me, those glowing eyes fixing on me with an intelligence that froze the blood in my veins. Then it did something I wasn't prepared for. It started walking directly toward me, on two legs, with a strange side-to-side swaying motion that was both awkward and terrifyingly efficient. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew enough about predators to know that running often triggers a chase response. So I backed up slowly, steadily, moving toward my truck where the headlights still illuminated a small patch of the road. Each backward step I took, it took one forward. The distance between us was closing, but I was getting closer to the truck too. The creature made no sound as it moved. No breathing, no footsteps I could hear over my own, nothing. When I was about 10 yards from my vehicle, I remembered the .22 caliber handgun holstered at my hip. It wasn't much, barely enough to deter a determined black bear, let alone whatever this was. But it was something. I drew it, hands shaking so badly I wasn't sure I could hit anything even if I tried. "Stop right there!" My voice cracked as I gave the command, gun pointed at the advancing figure. For a moment, it did stop. Those eyes stared at me, unblinking. It was close enough now that I could see more details. A broad chest covered in what might have been dark fur or hair, long arms that hung too low, fingers that seemed too long and articulated. Then, as suddenly as it had approached, it turned away. Not in fear, not running, just a deliberate pivot before it disappeared into the forest with surprising speed and silence for something its size. One moment it was there, the next it had vanished among the trees, those glowing eyes the last thing to disappear in the darkness. I stood there, gun still raised, for what felt like hours, but was probably less than a minute. My whole body was trembling, sweat running down my back, despite the cool night air. When I finally lowered the gun, my fingers were cramped from gripping it so tightly. I scrambled into the truck, locked the doors, and sat there with the engine running, scanning the tree line with wild eyes. Nothing moved, nothing showed itself, but I couldn't shake the certainty that it was still out there, watching. I radioed back to base, trying to keep my voice steady as I reported unusual activity at Gate 7. They asked if I needed backup. I said yes. 20 minutes later, my supervisor, Bill Mercer, pulled up in his SUV. By then, I'd managed to get myself somewhat under control, though my hands still shook as I described what I'd seen. Bill listened with a frown deepening on his weathered face. When I finished, he sighed and scratched at his graying beard. "Sounds like you saw a bear, Larry," he said, in a tone that made it clear he wasn't really considering alternatives. "It wasn't a bear, Bill. Bears don't stand 7 feet tall on 2 legs and walk straight at you. Bears can stand, especially if they're curious or feel threatened, and in the dark, with just headlights and a flashlight, perceptions get distorted." He wasn't being unkind, just dismissive in that way people often are when confronted with something that doesn't fit their understanding of the world. I knew what I'd seen. It hadn't been a bear. Bears don't have those kinds of eyes, don't move that way, don't have that kind of presence. But I could also see that pushing the issue wasn't going to get me anywhere, except maybe a psychiatric evaluation or a different shift. So I nodded and agreed that yeah, maybe it had been a bear, and I'd been spooked by the late hour and the isolation. Bill seemed relieved at my apparent acceptance of his explanation. He told me to take the rest of my shift off, said he'd cover for me, and suggested I get some sleep. I didn't sleep when I got home. I sat at my kitchen table with a pot of coffee, watching dawn break over the mountains, trying to make sense of what I'd encountered. It wasn't just that it had been strange or frightening. It was the intelligence I'd sensed in those eyes, the deliberate quality of its movements. Whatever it wasn't just an animal. When I went back to work the next night, I was tense, jumpy. I kept my gun closer than usual and found excuses to avoid Gate 7 until near the end of my shift. When I finally forced myself to check it, I sat in the truck for several minutes, scanning the tree line before getting out. There was nothing unusual, just the gate, the road, the dark line of trees against the night sky. No glowing eyes, no mysterious figure. I completed my check quickly and was about to leave when my radio crackled. It was Derek Simmons, another guard who worked the same general area, but usually on a different shift. He was covering for someone that night and asked if I could meet him at Gate 4 for a coffee break. I agreed, relieved at the thought of human company. Derek was already there when I arrived, sitting in his truck with 2 thermos cups of coffee. He was older than me, maybe mid-50s, with a leathery face that spoke of years in the Alaskan elements. He'd been working security in the area for over a decade. We made small talk for a while, discussing the weather, the job, local news. Then, just as I was starting to relax, Derek cleared his throat. "Heard you had some excitement last night," he said, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond our vehicles. I stiffened. "Bill tell you?" Derek nodded. "Said you saw a bear." I hesitated, then decided there was nothing to lose. "Wasn't a bear." Derek was quiet for a long moment, then, "I know." Those 2 words hung in the air between us. I turned to look at him, trying to read his expression in the dim light from our dashboards. "You've seen it too." It wasn't a question. He nodded slowly. "Locals have a name for it. Call it a kushka. First Nations people have stories going back generations about them." "What is it?" I asked, my mouth dry despite the coffee. Derek shrugged. "Nobody knows for sure. Some say it's just a type of Bigfoot. Others think it's something else entirely, but they're out there, whatever they are." "You've had more than one encounter?" I pressed. Derek's face tightened. "3 that I'm certain of. First time was at Gate 2 about 8 years ago. I was checking the perimeter fence when something hit me from behind. A rock, thrown hard enough to knock me unconscious. When I came to, nothing was missing, nothing disturbed. Just me with a lump on my head and that feeling of being watched." He took a sip of his coffee, his eyes distant with the memory. "Second time was 4 years later, right where you saw yours. I was doing a foot patrol along the tree line, looking for signs of trespassers, when I saw it feeding." "Feeding? On what?" "Grubs. It had rolled over this massive fallen log and was picking out grubs or beetles eating them. Just like a bear might, except it wasn't a bear. It was squatting there, using its fingers with a dexterity no bear has. When it noticed me, it stood up, 7, maybe 8 feet tall, and just stared. I backed away, and it let me go." Derek fell silent. I waited, but he seemed lost in thought. "You said 3 encounters," I prompted after a minute. He blinked, coming back to the present. "Yeah, last one was more recent, just last year. Just a glimpse through the trees, moving parallel to the road as I drove my rounds. Fast, faster than a man could run through that kind of terrain." "Have you reported these?" Derek laughed, a short, humorless sound. "To who? Management? You saw how Bill reacted to your story. They don't want to hear it. Makes them nervous, makes them think we're unreliable or unstable. And law enforcement, they'd laugh me out of the station." He wasn't wrong. Even as he spoke, I could imagine the reactions, the eye-rolling, the concerned looks, the subtle shifts in how people would treat me if I pushed this story. "So we just... what? Pretend it didn't happen?" I asked. Derek shrugged again. "You do whatever feels right to you. Me, I keep my eyes open and my gun loaded. I don't go looking for trouble, but I stay prepared for it. And I don't talk about it except with folks who've seen for themselves. We finished our coffee in silence after that, each lost in our own thoughts. When we parted ways, Derek clapped me on the shoulder. "Be careful out there, Larry, especially around Gate 7. That spot seems to draw them for some reason." For the rest of my time working security on Ravella Road, I never had another clear sighting like that first night. But there were moments, distant movement glimpsed through trees, unusual sounds in the darkness, the occasional sensation of being observed by unseen eyes. Each time, I remembered those glowing eyes and that deliberate walk, and I'd find myself scanning the tree line, hand resting on my holstered gun. I left that job about a year later, moved down to Juneau for better work. But I never forgot what I saw that night, or Derek's stories. Every now and then, I'll read about strange sightings in southeastern Alaska, hikers reporting tall, dark figures in remote areas, hunters finding unusual tracks or signs in the forest. Most get dismissed as bears or overactive imaginations. Some get labeled as Bigfoot encounters by enthusiasts. I don't know what to call what I saw. Kushka, Sasquatch, something else entirely. The name doesn't much matter. What matters is that it was real, it was intelligent, and it chose to let me go when it could have done otherwise. The forests of Alaska are vast and ancient, and there are places where humans rarely set foot. It doesn't seem so far-fetched to me that something could live in those shadows, something that knows the land better than we do, something that watches us come and go with those intelligent, glowing eyes. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Most don't. But if you ever find yourself on a lonely road in the Alaskan wilderness at night, and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck like you're being watched, trust that feeling. Because sometimes, out there in the darkness, there are eyes watching back. Story 14. My name is Carl Struthers, and I've carried this secret for too long. What happened that afternoon in 1978 near Saxman changed everything I understood about the world. I was 12 years old then, just a kid who thought he knew the woods like the back of his hand. It was September 18th, a Tuesday. School had let out early due to a teachers' conference, and I decided to take advantage of the extra daylight. Mom expected me home by dinner at 6, which gave me nearly 4 hours to explore. The air felt crisp that day, carrying the first bite of the coming Alaskan winter. Leaves crunched under my sneakers as I cut through the forest, following a path I'd walked 100 times before. Saxman sat just south of Ketchikan, a small community where everybody knew everybody. Our house was on the north edge of town, and my favorite fishing spot lay at the second creek, about 1.5 miles through the woods. Dad had taken me there since I was 6, and after he passed from his heart attack the previous winter, I'd continued going alone. Mom didn't like it, but she understood. That creek connected me to Dad. I carried my usual gear that day, a small tackle box, my rod, and a canvas bag with a peanut butter sandwich and a thermos of hot chocolate. The forest felt different somehow, quieter. I remember noticing how the birds had stopped singing about halfway through my hike. Even the constant rustle of squirrels had gone silent. At the time, I chalked it up to the changing season. The path to the creek required crossing a steep bank at the final approach. You had to scramble down about 15 feet of loose dirt and rocks to reach the water. I'd done it so many times I barely thought about it. But that day, as I approached the ridge, something made me stop. A smell hit me first, musky and strong, like wet dog mixed with something else I couldn't identify. I crept to the edge of the bank and peered over. That's when I saw it. Not 20 yards downstream, crouched at the water's edge, was a massive dark figure. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it as a bear. We had plenty in the area, and I'd been taught what to do if I encountered one. But this wasn't a bear. Its proportions were all wrong. It hunched forward on 2 legs, not 4, broad shoulders covered in thick dark brown fur that looked almost black where water had splashed on it. The creature's back was to me, and I could see powerful muscles shift beneath its pelt as it moved. It stood easily 7 feet tall, even in its crouched position. I froze, my heart hammering so loud I was certain the thing would hear it. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then the creature shifted, and I saw what it was doing. It had leaned forward toward the creek and was drinking water. But not like any animal I'd ever seen. Its massive arms extended, and I watched in disbelief as it cupped its hands, actual hands with fingers, not paws, and brought water to what must have been its mouth. The gesture was so human, so deliberate, that my brain short-circuited. Bears don't cup their hands. Nothing in these woods cups its hands except people, but this was not a person. A twig snapped under my foot as I shifted my weight. The sound seemed to explode in the silence of the forest. The creature's head whipped around, water dripping from what I now saw was a broad, flat face covered in the same dark fur. Its eyes locked with mine, deep-set eyes that reflected not animal confusion, but something that looked horribly like intelligence, recognition. I didn't think, I didn't plan. Pure terror shot through my body like electricity, and I ran. My fishing gear clattered to the ground behind me as I sprinted back the way I'd come. Branches whipped my face. I tripped over roots and scrambled back up without feeling the pain. My lungs burned, but I didn't slow down. I kept waiting to hear it behind me, heavy footfalls or crashing through the underbrush, but there was nothing except my own panicked breathing and the thud of my sneakers on the forest floor. I didn't stop running until I burst from the tree line near the edge of town. Only then did I look back, half expecting to see the massive shape emerging from the trees. The forest stood silent and still. Nothing followed me. My house was still a quarter-mile away. I walked now, legs shaking so badly I could barely stay upright. By the time I reached our front porch, my terror had morphed into something else, an urgent need to tell someone, to confirm what I'd seen was real. I crashed through the front door, nearly colliding with my grandmother who was setting the table for an early dinner. "Carl Samuel Struthers, what in heaven's name—" She stopped mid-sentence, dish towel in hand, staring at my face. "What happened to you, boy?" I couldn't catch my breath enough to speak. Mum appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "Carl, you're bleeding." I touched my cheek, surprised to find a thin cut where a branch had caught me. The words tumbled out then, all at once, and jumbled. In the forest, by the creek, there was this thing. It wasn't a bear. It was drinking with its hands, cupped hands. It saw me. Mom and Grandma exchanged a look I didn't understand. Grandma crossed the room in 3 quick steps and shut the front door, then pulled the curtains closed. "Sit down," Mom said, her voice unnaturally calm. She guided me to the kitchen table. "Start again, slowly." I told them everything, from the silence in the forest to the creature's intelligent eyes. With each detail, their faces grew more serious. When I described how it had cupped its hands to drink, Grandma made a small noise in her throat and reached for the silver cross she always wore. When I finished, silence filled the kitchen. Mum poured me a glass of water with shaking hands. Grandma sat heavily in the chair across from me. "You listen to me now, Carl," Grandma said finally, her voice low and urgent. "What you saw today, you don't tell anyone about it, not your friends, not at school, no one." "But, no buts," Mum cut in. "Your grandmother's right." "Was it a bear?" I asked, already knowing the answer. Mom shook her head slightly. "Some things in these forests are older than Saxman, older than Ketchikan. The Tlingit people have stories." She stopped when Grandma gave her a warning look. "It doesn't matter what it was," Grandma said firmly. "What matters is you stay away from that creek from now on, and you keep this to yourself." "Why?" I demanded. "If there's something dangerous in the woods, shouldn't people know?" "It's not dangerous if left alone," Grandma said. "It's been here longer than us. This is its home too." "But what is it?" Mom and Grandma exchanged another look. "Some things don't need names," Grandma said finally. "Just promise us, Carl, this stays between us." I promised, but even at 12, I knew I wouldn't keep it. How could I? I'd seen something impossible, something that changed everything. The next day at school, I couldn't focus on anything. Mrs. Harlow called on me twice in math class, and both times I had no idea what she'd asked. At lunch, I sat next to my best friend, George Jenkins, picking at my food without eating. "What's wrong with you?" George asked, mouthful of cafeteria pizza. "You look like you saw a ghost." "Not a ghost," I said before I could stop myself. George raised his eyebrows, instantly intrigued. George was 13, a grade ahead of me, but we'd been friends since kindergarten. His dad worked on the same fishing boat my dad had before he died. "What does that mean?" George pressed. I glanced around the cafeteria, then leaned closer. "If I tell you something, you have to swear not to tell anyone else." George nodded eagerly, already scooting closer. "I mean it, George. Swear on your comic collection." "Fine, I swear on my entire X-Men collection. Now spill it." So I did. I told him everything I'd told Mom and Grandma, watching his expression shift from curiosity to disbelief, and finally to something approaching awe. "Bullshit," he said when I finished, but his voice lacked conviction. "I'm serious. It cupped its hands, George, like this." I demonstrated, scooping imaginary water. "Animals don't do that." George was quiet for a moment. "My grandfather used to talk about something in the woods. The tribal elders don't like people discussing it, especially with outsiders." George was half Tlingit on his father's side. His grandfather had been a respected elder before he passed 3 years ago. "What did he call it?" I asked. George shrugged. "He used a Tlingit word, but when my dad asked him to translate it once, he just said, 'the one who watches.' Said, they've been in these forests since before people." A chill ran down my spine. "Do you believe me?" "I don't know," George admitted, "but my grandfather wasn't the type to make up stories." He hesitated. "We could go back, try to see it again." "No way," I said immediately, my palms sweating at the mere thought. "You didn't see its eyes, George." "Fine," he conceded, "but you gotta promise to tell me if you ever see it again." I promised, though I had no intention of ever going near that creek again. For 3 weeks I kept my word to my mother and grandmother. I stayed close to town, took the long way to school to avoid the forest edge, and tried to convince myself that what I'd seen had been a bear after all. Maybe the light had played tricks, maybe my imagination had filled in details that weren't really there. But I knew better. On October 12th, everything changed again. I remember the date because it was Columbus Day, and we'd had a special assembly at school. I was walking home alone. George had dentist appointment, when I noticed something odd about our house as I approached. The front door stood wide open. Mom was always strict about keeping doors closed with winter coming on. Even in summer she complained about bugs getting in if we left a door open too long. An open door in October wasn't just unusual, it was wrong. "Mom!" I called from the yard. No answer. My footsteps slowed as I approached the porch. Something dark marked the white-painted boards, smears that looked disturbingly like muddy handprints, large handprints. "Mom!" I called again, my voice cracking. "Grandma!" The house remained silent. I climbed the 3 porch steps, my heart pounding just like that day in the forest. The mud on the porch did form handprints, massive ones with clear finger marks, at least twice the size of my father's hands. Inside, the front room looked undisturbed. Nothing broken, nothing out of place, just the unnatural silence. "Hello?" I tried again, moving toward the kitchen. That's where I found the note on the table, written in my mother's hasty scrawl. "Gone to hospital with Grandma. Mrs. Peterson coming to stay with you. Do not leave house." Relief washed over me, followed immediately by concern for Grandma. She'd been having chest pains lately, though she tried to hide them. It must have been her heart. But that didn't explain the handprints on the porch. I went back outside to examine them more closely. The mud hadn't fully dried yet. Whatever left them had been here recently. As I crouched to look, I noticed something else, a distinctive smell hanging in the air, the same musky odor I'd detected by the creek. A car door slammed on the street, making me jump. Mrs. Peterson, our elderly neighbor, hurried up the front walk. "There you are, Carl. Your mother called me in a state. Your grandmother's taken ill, and she's gone with her to Ketchikan General." She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, her eyes fixed on the muddy prints. "What in heaven's name is that?" "Just mud," I said quickly. "I was, playing before I came in." Mrs. Peterson gave me a doubtful look. I'd never been the type to play in mud even when I was younger, but she didn't press the issue. "Well, wash up and come inside. I've brought over a casserole for dinner." I followed her in, casting one last look at those massive handprints. Something had come to our house looking for something, or someone. Mom returned late that night after Mrs. Peterson had gone to bed in our spare room. I pretended to be asleep, but crept to the top of the stairs when I heard the front door open. Through the railing, I watched Mom slump into a kitchen chair, her face buried in her hands. She looked exhausted, older somehow. After a few moments, she rose and went to the telephone, dialing a number and speaking too quietly for me to hear much. But I caught fragments. "Came to the house, looking for him. No, Carl wasn't home. Stable for now, but the doctor said, need to tell him the truth." "Tell me the truth about what?" I wondered. About Grandma's condition, or about something else entirely? I slipped back to bed before Mom could catch me eavesdropping, but sleep eluded me. The image of those handprints kept floating before my eyes. Whatever I'd seen at the creek had come here, to my home. It had reached out with those massive hands and touched my front door, and somehow, impossibly, it was connected to my grandmother. 2 days later, Mom finally brought Grandma home from the hospital. She looked pale and moved slowly, but insisted she was fine. Just a spell, she called it. Mom had taken time off from her job at the cannery to care for her, keeping her settled in the living room recliner with a constant supply of tea and soup. I waited until the evening, when Mom went out to the garage to search for more blankets to confront Grandma. "What came to our house while you were gone?" I asked without preamble. Grandma's eyes, normally sharp as tacks, shifted away from mine. "I don't know what you're talking about." "The handprints on the porch. They were from that thing I saw in the forest, weren't they? The one that drinks with cupped hands." Her fingers clutched the blanket covering her lap. "Carl, please, no more secrets," I insisted. "It came looking for me, didn't it? That's why you got sick. You were scared." Grandma sighed deeply. "Not for you," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "For me." Before I could ask what she meant, Mom returned with an armful of blankets. She took one look at our faces and froze. "What's going on?" "He knows something came to the house," Grandma said. "He's made the connection." Mom set the blankets down, her mouth a thin line. "He's too young." "I was younger than him when my grandmother told me," Grandma countered. "And times are different now. He's already seen it. He deserves to know why." Mom looked torn, but finally nodded. "I'll make some hot chocolate first. This is going to be a long conversation." 20 minutes later, the three of us sat in the living room, steaming mugs in hand. Outside, darkness had fallen completely, and rain pattered against the windows. Mom had drawn all the curtains and locked every door and window twice. "What you saw in the forest," Grandma began, "has been known to our family for generations. My grandmother called them the Watchers. The Tlingit people have their own name for them." "They're real?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. "As real as you and me," Grandma confirmed. "They lived in these forests long before people came. Mostly, they keep to themselves, deep in the mountains. But sometimes—" She paused, looking to Mom for support. Sometimes they form connections with certain people, Mum continued. Families. Like ours, I guessed. Grandma nodded. My grandmother could speak with them. Not with words exactly, but they understood each other. When I was a girl, one of them saved me when I fell through river ice in winter. After that, I could sometimes sense when they were near. But why did it come to our house? I asked. Because I was dying, Grandma said simply. The heart attack was worse than I let on. When it happened, when I felt myself slipping away in the ambulance, I called out, not with my voice, with something else. And it answered, Mom added. The doctors can't explain her recovery. They were ready to pronounce her gone when her heart suddenly stabilized. I stared at them both, trying to process everything. So this thing, this watcher, it what, healed you somehow? I believe it did, yes, Grandma said. They've been protectors of our family for generations. But why me? Why did I see it at the creek? Mom and Grandma exchanged a look I couldn't interpret. The gift passes down, Grandma explained. Not to everyone, but you have it, Carl. That's why you were able to see it clearly. Most people would just glimpse a shadow, convince themselves it was a bear or their imagination. And that's why you didn't want me to tell anyone, I realized. You were protecting it. Protecting you both, Mom corrected. People fear what they don't understand. If word got out, there would be hunters in those woods with guns, or scientists wanting to capture one, and the watchers would disappear deeper into the wilderness, breaking a connection that's kept our family safe for generations. I thought about the creature's intelligent eyes, the way it had looked directly at me, with what seemed like recognition. Does it know me? I asked. It knows our bloodline, Grandma said. And now it knows you specifically. You've been marked in a way. The implications of everything they were saying washed over me. This wasn't just a strange encounter. This was my heritage, something passed down through my family's blood. What should I do? I asked. Nothing, Mum said firmly. You live your life normally. You stay away from that creek for now, until you're older and understand more. And you keep this secret. But George, I started, then stopped abruptly, guilt flooding through me. George Jenkins? Grandma asked sharply. You told him? I nodded miserably. The day after it happened. Mum closed her eyes briefly. His family has their own connection to the Watchers, different from ours. That's all I'll say about that. So he might believe me. He might, Grandma acknowledged, but that doesn't change the need for discretion. These are dangerous times for old secrets, Carl. You must be more careful. I promised I would be, and this time I meant it. That night, lying in bed, I thought about the creature by the creek. Had it recognized something familiar in me when our eyes met? Was that why it hadn't pursued me through the forest? I touched my chest, wondering if whatever connected Grandma to these beings lived in me too. If someday I might understand the gift she spoke of. Outside my window, rain continued to fall on the Alaskan night, and somewhere in the dark forest beyond Saxman, something moved between the ancient trees on hands that cupped water like a human's, watching and waiting as it had for countless generations. Story 15. The morning air bit at my face as I adjusted my pack. November in southeast Alaska doesn't offer much daylight, and we planned to make the most of it. My name's Henry Anderson, though most folks just call me H.A., and I've hunted these islands since I was old enough to hold a rifle. This trip to Baranof Island was nothing special, just our annual deer hunt with the same crew I'd been going out with for years. Weather reports holding, Mike Callahan said, zipping up his orange vest. Mike was built like a refrigerator, had worked the logging camps for 20 years, and knew this part of Alaska better than most. Think we'll get anything today? Asked Jeff Porter, the youngest of our group at 32. He'd moved up from Oregon 5 years back, and still had that eagerness that old-timers like me had lost decades ago. Depends if you can actually hit something this time, I replied, checking my .30-06 Springfield. Tom Belcher, our fourth, just grunted as he shouldered his pack. Tom didn't talk much, but he could track a deer through rock if he had to. We'd set up our base camp about 40 miles south of Sitka on the Baranof Island side of Walker Channel. It was remote enough that we wouldn't run into other hunters, but still accessible by the small aluminum boat we'd anchored in a protected cove. The area was thick with Sitka spruce and hemlock, with occasional clearings where deer liked to browse. We set out before dawn, our headlamps cutting weak paths through the lingering darkness. The temperature hovered around 35 degrees, not terrible for November in Alaska, but cold enough that every breath came out as a cloud of vapor. Light snow from the previous night crunched under our boots, making tracking easier. "Let's split at the creek, work our way up and meet at the ridge by noon," I suggested. We'd hunted this way before, covering more ground individually, but staying within shouting distance. "Works for me," Mike replied, checking his compass. For 3 hours, I worked my way up a gradual slope, following fresh deer tracks that crossed back and forth through small drainages. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional raven call and the soft sound of snow falling from branches. I spotted 2 does, but held my fire, hoping for a buck later. Around 11, I heard Mike's whistle from my left, our signal that he'd spotted something. I changed direction and headed toward him, careful to watch my footing on the slippery forest floor. Within 15 minutes, I found Mike and Jeff standing at the edge of a small clearing. "Tom's coming from the north side," Jeff said quietly. Mike spotted a nice buck heading up toward that ridge. He pointed to a rocky outcrop about a quarter-mile ahead. When Tom arrived, we formulated a quick plan. Tom and I would circle around to the east side of the ridge, while Mike and Jeff approached from the west, hopefully pushing any deer between us. It was a standard drive technique we'd used successfully for years. Tom and I set off, moving quietly through thicker underbrush as we climbed. The weather was closing in, with low clouds reducing visibility and a light wind picking up from the southeast. Not ideal conditions, but not bad enough to call it a day. After working our way around the base of the ridge, Tom gestured for us to separate slightly. I nodded and veered right, watching the terrain for any movement. The snow made the forest floor brighter than usual, creating a strange half-light under the canopy. I'd been walking for about 20 minutes when I came to a small rise. Beyond it, the trees thinned out into what looked like a more open area. I moved forward cautiously, scanning for any sign of deer. As I crested the rise, I saw Tom approaching from my left about 30 yards away. He saw me too and raised his hand in acknowledgement. That's when I noticed something standing at the far end of the clearing. At first, I thought it was a brown bear. It stood partly obscured by a spruce tree, but it was big, significantly larger than any deer. In one fluid motion, I raised my rifle, automatically clicking off the safety as I brought the scope to my eye. Through the scope, I got a better look, and my finger froze on the trigger. This was no bear. The figure stood upright, completely vertical on 2 legs. Bears rear up temporarily, but this creature's posture was natural, relaxed even. It stood at least 9 feet tall, maybe more, with broad shoulders and a large head set directly on those shoulders with little visible neck. Dark brown fur covered its entire body, not the black of a black bear or the variable brown of a grizzly, but a uniform dark chocolate color. I lowered my rifle slightly, blinking to make sure I wasn't seeing things. By then, Tom had spotted it too. He had his rifle halfway raised, but like me, he hesitated. Mike and Jeff emerged from the trees on the opposite side of the clearing. They froze immediately, and I saw Mike's arm shoot out to stop Jeff from moving forward. All 4 of us stood perfectly still, rifles partially raised, staring at the creature not 40 yards away. For what felt like an eternity but was probably closer to a minute, the thing just stood there, watching us. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs. The creature's eyes, which I couldn't clearly make out at that distance, seemed fixed on our group, studying us with what felt like intelligence. There was no aggression in its posture, no signs it was preparing to charge or flee. It simply observed us with what I can only describe as deliberate curiosity. Then, with slow, purposeful movements, it turned slightly and began to walk away. Not the lumbering gait of a bear or the quick escape of a startled deer, but long, measured strides on two legs. Its arms, proportionally longer than a human's, swung naturally at its sides. With each step, I could see powerful muscles shifting beneath the fur of its thighs and back. It disappeared into the thicker brush beyond the clearing, the vegetation swallowing its massive form surprisingly quickly. None of us moved or spoke for at least 30 seconds after it vanished. "What the hell was that?" Jeff finally whispered, his voice tight. Mike lowered his rifle completely. "Not a bear." Tom and I approached them, all of us instinctively huddling closer together as we met in the middle of the clearing. "Did you all see that?" I asked, needing confirmation I hadn't hallucinated. 3 nods answered me. 9, maybe 10 feet tall, Tom said quietly. It was more words than he'd strung together all day. "Walked on 2 legs, Mike added, the whole time." We stood there discussing what we'd seen, our voices kept low, as if the creature might still be listening. Jeff suggested we track it, but Mike immediately shot down that idea. "Whatever that was, it's bigger than anything we're equipped to handle," he said firmly. We examined the area where the creature had stood. The ground was partially covered with snow, and we found tracks, large human-like footprints over 18 inches long and at least 8 inches wide at the ball of the foot. They sank deeper into the forest floor than any of our boot prints, suggesting enormous weight. "That's no known animal," Tom said, crouching beside one of the tracks. "Not in Alaska. Not anywhere." The footprints led off in the direction the creature had walked, disappearing into the dense underbrush. None of us suggested following them further. By unspoken agreement, we abandoned our hunt and returned to camp, walking close together and frequently checking our surroundings. The excitement of the morning had been replaced by an uneasy vigilance. We packed up our camp quickly, loaded the boat, and headed back toward Sitka earlier than planned. That night, in the relative safety of the small fishing lodge where we'd rented rooms, we tried to make sense of what we'd seen. "It wasn't a bear," I repeated for maybe the 10th time. "I've hunted black bears and brown bears all my life. That wasn't a bear." "Too tall," Mike agreed. "And the way it walked." "It looked at us," Jeff added, his earlier eagerness replaced by a disturbed expression. "Like it was thinking, considering us." Tom, who'd been quiet as usual, finally spoke up. "My grandfather used to talk about something in these woods, called it Kushtaka in the native tongue. Land otter man," Mike nodded. "Tlingit legend." I shook my head. This wasn't an otter or any kind of marine animal. This was something else. "Bigfoot?" Jeff suggested, looking almost embarrassed to say it out loud. No one dismissed the idea outright, which was telling. "I've been hunting these islands for 30 years, I said slowly. "I know what belongs here and what doesn't. That thing, whatever it was, I've never seen anything like it. Never even heard stories of anything that big walking on 2 legs in these forests." We reported the sighting to a conservation officer in Sitka the next day. He took notes politely enough, but clearly didn't put much stock in our story. He suggested we'd seen a brown bear with mange or an unusually large black bear standing on its hind legs. When we insisted it had walked away on 2 legs, he just smiled and said stress and poor visibility can play tricks on the mind. But 4 experienced hunters don't have the same hallucination at the same time. We knew what we saw. I returned to Baranof Island the following summer with Mike, bringing cameras and better equipment. We spent a week searching the area where we'd had our encounter, but found nothing conclusive, just some broken branches higher up than a bear would typically reach, and a few ambiguous hair samples we couldn't identify. That was in 1997. I've been back to Baranof Island many times since, sometimes to hunt, sometimes just to look. I've never seen the creature again, but I remain convinced that something unknown lives in those remote forests. Last year, in 2019, I heard about another sighting near Redoubt Lake, about 20 miles from where we had our encounter. Two kayakers described seeing a tall, fur-covered figure watching them from the shoreline. Their description matched what we saw 22 years earlier. I'm 73 now, too old for serious backcountry expeditions. My hunting days are mostly behind me. But sometimes, on clear nights, I find myself looking at maps of Baranof Island, tracing the contours of those remote valleys and ridges with my finger, wondering where it lives, how many others might be out there, and how they've remained hidden for so long. Science tells us there are no undiscovered large mammals in North America. The forests have been mapped, logged, studied, and explored. But Alaska is different. Southeast Alaska's islands contain some of the densest, most impenetrable temperate rainforests in the world. Thousands of square miles remain virtually untouched by human feet. I know what I saw that November morning. It wasn't a bear, a moose, or any other known animal. It was something that shouldn't exist according to biology textbooks, but it does. It stood there, watched us with evident intelligence, and then calmly walked away on two legs. I've told this story many times over the years. Some people believe me, most don't. The conservation officer's explanation, a bear with mange standing on its hind legs, has become the official response to our report. But official explanations don't change what happened. Tom passed away in 2012. Jeff moved back to Oregon a few years after our encounter. Only Mike and I still talk about it regularly. Sometimes, when we're having a drink together, we'll go through the details again, making sure our memories haven't shifted or embellished the experience. They haven't. The details remain as clear as they were that day. The height, the deliberate way it moved, the intelligence behind its gaze. Whatever we saw that day in the forests of Baranof Island, it wasn't something that exists in any wildlife guide. It was something else, something that challenges what we think we know about the world around us. It was a reminder that even in 1997, even today, there are still mysteries in the wilderness, still things that defy easy explanation. That's my story. I don't expect everyone to believe it, but it happened. I know because I was there. I saw it with my own eyes. And somewhere in the remote forests of southeast Alaska, I believe it's still out there, watching and waiting, rarely seen but always present, a living reminder that we haven't discovered everything yet. And maybe, just maybe, we're not supposed to.